This program is about 2.5 hours.
Rutherford Burchard Hayes was delivered by Dr. Reuben Lamb for a fee of $3.50 on October 4th, 1822. Rudd, as he was called, was raised by his mother, Sophia, and his uncle, Sardis Burchard, in a house on William Street in Delaware, Ohio. As a child, his favorite things included making sugar and cider and playing with his older sister and constant companion, Fanny. "The confidant of all my life," he later said of her. "I loved her as only a brother loves a sister who is perfect." School instructors described Hayes as well-informed, polite, and respected by his peers. He was considered both confident and motivated. At 19, he wrote in his diary,
"I have always been ambitious, dreaming of future glory, of performing some virtuous or patriotic action."
He was class valedictorian at Kenyon College in 1842, and later, at age 22, graduated from Harvard Law School. After closing his private law practice in Fremont, he moved to Cincinnati and opened another firm. Hayes was also busy supporting political candidates, such as the Whig Party's Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott, as well as Republican John Fremont. Fanny attempted to play matchmaker for her brother, but his inability to commit to any one woman frustrated her.
"I have done with selecting a wife for you, brother. So suit yourself and I'll be suited, reserving the privilege of putting in a word before the bargain is made."
Finally, in 1850, at the age of 28, Hayes became reacquainted with a family friend, Lucy Ware Webb. They married on December 30th, 1852. 2 months later, he wrote,
"The dear friend who is to share with me the joys and ills of our earthly being grows steadily nearer and dearer to me. Let me strive to be as true to her as she is to me."
Hayes's interest in politics continued to flourish, and in 1864, while serving as a general in the Civil War, he was elected to the House of Representatives. He resigned from the Army after the war and served 3 years in the House before becoming governor of Ohio. In 1876, he received the Republican presidential nomination. His election was contested, but an electoral commission determined Hayes won, and on March 3, 1877, he was sworn into office. William Alman Wheeler served as his vice president. While in the White House, the Hayeses were often criticized for their zeal for temperance. Mrs. Hayes was nicknamed Lemonade Lucy, and after a party one evening, a guest sarcastically remarked, "It was a brilliant affair. The water flowed like champagne." Mrs. Hayes instituted the annual Easter egg roll on the South Lawn. Together, the couple enjoyed a hymn night each Sunday in the upstairs library. For their 25th wedding anniversary, the Hayeses renewed their wedding vows in the Blue Room. The first First Lady to have graduated from college, Mrs. Hayes opposed slavery and women's suffrage. It has been said that it was she who influenced her husband to desert the Whig Party and join the anti-slavery Republican Party. He was rumored to have influenced her decision not to support a woman's right to vote. With Reconstruction finally resolved, Hayes dealt with issues of Chinese immigration, civil service reform, the Panama Canal, and U.S. currency. He made an unprecedented trip to the West Coast with Lucy and 2 of their 5 children. In all, Hayes believed he left the office in better condition than when he found it.
"I have often said that it would be difficult to find one which began with so rough a situation, and few which closed with so smooth a sea."
Hayes declined renomination and instead retired to his Spiegel Grove estate in Fremont, Ohio. He died at age 70 on January 17, 1893. Content in retirement, Hayes told a friend,
"Nobody ever left the presidency with less regret, less disappointment, fewer heartburnings, or more general content with the result of his term than I do."
Clasp the hand of the man for gallant days, and we'll be true. For north and south, for east and and west can float the flag that's over us. Rutherford Hayes in honest ways, with millions in the chorus. Come on, ye jolly boys in gray, and you, my boys in blue, we'll clasp the hand of all the land for gallant Hayes, and we will do for north and south, for east.
Welcome to Fremont, Ohio, home of the 19th President of the United States, Rutherford B. Hayes, as C-SPAN continues its series featuring 41 presidents of the United States. And we have guests here today that are going to help us better understand who Rutherford B. Hayes was, including Roger Bridges, who's the director of the Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Center, and Ari Hogenboom, who has written the book Rutherford B. Hayes, Warrior and President. Gentlemen, start with Roger Bridges. Where are we?
Well, we're standing on the north side of the Hayes Presidential Center here in Fremont, opposite the main entrance, the old main entrance of the Hayes Presidential Center. And this is the home where Hayes lived from 1873 to 1893 in 26 acres.
Ari Hogenboom, how did this man become president?
Availability. It's a 19th century term. We don't use it very much in the 20th century, although Harding has been called the available man. But he was essentially perhaps the least obnoxious to the major candidates. He was everybody's second choice, nobody's really first choice. It's got people in Ohio. He was the favorite son of Ohio.
How long was he president?
4 years, 1877 to 1881.
And Roger Bridges, this has some fame to it right here. What is it?
Well, these are the gates that stood around the White House in when Hayes was president and some years thereafter. They came to the Presidential Center in 1928 after a lot of negotiations by Webb Hayes, who was the founder of this institution. And they've hung here since 1928. But these are the gates that were around the White House when Hayes was there, 1877 to 81.
And Ari Hogenboom, how did you get interested? As a matter of fact, I think what we'll do now is walk a little bit beyond the museum and library here so we can go over to where the house is. But
Sure.
How did you get interested in this man?
Right. I did a dissertation on civil service reform, and Hayes is central to the introduction of civil service reform in federal offices, particularly New York City Custom House and Post Office. They were the most important offices, the largest offices in the country at that time. And during the Hayes administration, it was demonstrated that civil service reform, that is the merit system, the people taking competitive examinations and non-political appointments being made, it worked. And when time came for the big debate over the Pendleton Act in 1883, the reformers could point to the success of the experiment in the New York City Custom House and Post Office.
Roger Bridges, how long has this been here and who supports it?
The center has been here since 1916. It's been expanded in 3 different phases, this building. It's supported by the Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Center, Inc., a not-for-profit trust, and the state of Ohio through the Ohio Historical Society, along with private contributions and that sort of thing.
We want to get our audience involved. The numbers are on the screen and you can begin dialing. We'll try to take some calls either as we walk or by the time we get over to the place where we're going to be sitting for a while. Talk about the presidential commission that got this man elected in the first place. How did that happen?
Well, the election was disputed, and the Hayes people argued that the president of the Senate, who is the vice president of the United States, or the president, the presiding officer of the Senate, could select the votes to be counted. However, it had to be done in the presence of the House of Representatives and the Senate, and the Democrats had a majority. Hayes was a Republican. And the argument was, does the House, does the joint session decide what votes to be counted, or does the President of the Senate? Most people thought that the President of the Senate couldn't do it. They worked out a compromise of 5 members from the House, 5 members from the Senate, 5 members from the Supreme Court. It was neatly balanced politically, except for the final member of the Supreme Court from the Supreme Court. Unfortunately, the plan fell through to have an independent David Davis of Illinois, a justice of the Supreme Court, because he backed out, and he backed out when he was elected senator from Illinois with Democratic votes. and a monumental miscalculation on the part of Democrats, actually. And a Republican was selected in his place. The Republicans had an 8-7 margin, and everything was decided by an 8-7 vote. Bradley, Justice Bradley, the man who really decided the election, was a Republican, not a terribly partisan man, but he decided not to go behind the returns, to accept the returns, the official returns from the states as they came in, no matter what hanky-panky went on in the states themselves.
Roger Bridges, why only one term?
Well, Hayes believed that to serve 2 terms meant that the second term you'd be spending all of your time trying for re-election. He believed you ought to be able to accomplish all that you wanted to do with the mandate you received in the first term, although he really preferred a 6-year term, such as the Confederates had used during the pretended Confederate States of America period.
This sounds like a setup, and I guess it is, but somewhere near here is the R.E. Hogenboom Memorial Tree.
Right there. There it is.
Why is there a tree named after you?
Well, I wrote a book about Hayes, and can I go over and hug it?
Yeah, if you'd like. Sure.
Okay, it's my tree, and I want to hug this tree. Yep, there we are.
How did Roger Bridges? Why is there a tree?
It's a great
named after
tree,
this
a
man?
great
Well, the
oak
reason
tree.
there's
and
a
it's
tree named
wonderful
after
oak grove
Ari
here at
is
Spiegel
because
Grove.
we have this tradition in the Grove of naming trees after eminent visitors such as presidents, vice presidents, justices of the Supreme Court, and those who have contributed significantly to an understanding of Rutherford B. Hayes. And we think that Ari's book does more to contribute to the understanding of Rutherford B. Hayes than anything in recent memory.
How many trees are named after people here?
We have about 50 trees named after people, including another tree named after Hayes' first significant biographer, Williams. So we've got 2 trees named for biographers.
Now, where is the former president buried?
The former president is buried just about 300 yards from where we are right now, at what was once a pet burying ground, but a spot where they enjoyed contemplating world events. And it was Hayes' favorite spot. Moved here actually in 1916 when the place opened. He formerly had been buried in Oakwood Cemetery at the time of his death.
And about the house, have you spent much time, R.E. Hogenboom, in the house?
No, my wife has. I've spent time in the library. I've gone through the house on a few occasions, but Roger really knows the house much better than I do, and Tom Culbertson.
Which we're going to learn about later. Who lived here?
Well, Rutherford B. Hayes, of course, lived here. It was built by Sardis Burchard, his uncle, and his uncle actually did live here, although it was supposed to be a place for Hayes to get away from the heat of Cincinnati, Hayes and his family. Subsequently, Hayes' second oldest son, Webb Cook Hayes I, lived there, and Webb Cook Hayes II and Webb Cook Hayes III lived in this house before it was turned over to the state.
You know, before we go up on the porch, I want to take an opportunity here to show this whole area. Because a lot of people were out here walking this morning. What is this? How big is this whole area?
As I said earlier, we have 26 acres within a triangle-shaped area. This was part of a former 140-acre farm and estate that the Hayes had owned. People are in here walking every day, 365 days of the year, or 366 during leap year, of course. It's open daylight hours to anybody who wants to come in and walk or jog. Just can't skateboard.
Now, R.E. Hogenboom, what different offices did Rutherford B. Hayes hold in his life?
He's solicitor for the city of Cincinnati. He was elected to Congress in 1864. Served a full term and then part of a second term in Congress. Resigned from Congress to run for governor, elected governor for 2 terms, got out of politics very briefly, returned to politics when the Republican Party was in bad shape and needed its best vote getter, which he was. Elected governor again in 1875. Since he won in 1875 in a key state, he was obviously, this gave him a leg up, as it were, toward the nomination in 1876, President of the United States. And then, of course, he retired, but was extremely active in his post-presidential years, more so than any president except Jimmy Carter, involved in social causes, actually.
And the family, how many children did he have? How many descendants are around now?
He had 8 children in all, 5 of whom lived to adulthood, 7 boys and 1 girl. I can't tell you how many descendants there are today, but they are numerous.
We're going to go up on, I tell you what we're going to do. We're going to tell our folks we're going to take a break before we go much farther with this, and we'll come back here and then try to take some calls from our audience, because that's always the best part of it, getting calls from around the country. We'll take a short break, and we'll continue our coverage of Rutherford B. Hayes, 19th President of the United States.
Rutherford B. Hayes was elected governor right after the Civil War, 1867. At the time, he was practicing law in Cincinnati. The Republican Party was looking for someone to run from that part of the state, someone who had a good war record, and of course Hayes had served in the war as an officer, someone who would defend the 14th Amendment. At the time, there was a question about whether the state legislature was going to rescind the 14th Amendment here in Ohio. So the Republicans were looking for somebody who would defend the 14th Amendment. They chose Hayes. Hayes was a congressman, of course, at the time. Hayes won a very razor-thin victory. The Republicans lost the House and Senate. Hayes had, of course, a hostile legislature. By the way, the Republicans also lost the vote for universal suffrage, universal manhood suffrage at the time, which was a provision to provide rights for black voters to vote in Ohio, black male voters. They lost that. So Hayes came in with a very narrow victory, an opposition party in charge of the both houses, and the loss of a major initiative on the part of the Republicans. So the first 2 years in office, a very difficult time for him. He faced a legislature that he had difficulty getting appointments through, and if he satisfied the legislature, he found that he was not satisfying the members of the party, and of course at that time patronage was very big, so he felt constantly caught between the legislature and the members of the party that were pushing for patronage votes. He succeeded, though, in managing the state, ran for a second term, 69, got a friendlier legislature, not a totally friendly legislature, but a friendly legislature, and managed to put in effect his program. Hayes, I often say to people, as governor, was really probably one of the first modern governors. His program was something that we'd recognize today as being worthy of the state. I mean, there wasn't a lot of emphasis on things like canals, which today we would find, who knows what a canal is today. His interest was in providing better care for indigent people. He led in the creation of the state mental institution, as it was called at the time, the asylum. He pushed for the improvement treatment of prisoners, penal reform. He was very much a balanced budget person. The state had come out of the Civil War with a large debt. He strove to get the funds to pay the debt down, succeeded in doing it. Was very much a person interested in things other than politics. It was Hayes, for example, who really pushed for the completion of the collection of the gubernatorial portraits. If you go around this building, wherein you'll find in the hearing rooms portraits of former governors. His predecessor, Cox, had started the project of collecting the portraits of former governors. Hayes was really the one, though, that saw it through to completion. Was a man who was interested in education. Under Hayes' guidance, the Ohio State University was organized. Again, there had been talk of a university before Hayes took office, but it was Hayes that saw it through to completion. Hayes, after he left office as governor and indeed as president, developed an avid interest in history, was one of the organizers of the Ohio Historical Society, was a genealogical researcher. In fact, he did some genealogical research right here in his office, right where we're sitting, as governor, and spent a lot of time promoting education generally, all sorts of issues, appointments of superintendents, professional superintendents of schools, better funding for education, got embroiled in again, something that sounds very modern today, the religious issue, how much religious instruction should take place in the classroom. Was deeply involved in the debate that took place here in his third term, the early part of his third term, over a bill that would have allowed instruction in some of the state-sponsored schools, the blind school, the deaf school, and so on. So I think people, if people could be transported back to the late 1860s, early 1870s, take away the funny words that was used in newspapers, phrase them in modern terms, find that the issues that Hayes were dealing with, and indeed some of the positions that Hayes took, sound very modern. One thing that might not sound so modern was Hayes was constantly chiding the General Assembly. He complained of too much legislation. He thought that the General Assembly spent too much time here in Columbus and passed too many laws. In that sense, we probably wouldn't find him acceptable today, but other than that, he was really the first of the modern Ohio governors, I think. Ohio had come out of the Civil War as one of the main bastions of the Republican Party. If you think of the radical Republicans in Lincoln's cabinet, many of them were associated with Ohio. Ohio came out of Ohio. The state was also, in one sense, a border state. The southern and eastern part of the state bordered the Confederacy, and there was a good many Southern sympathizers. So the old Democratic Party hung on for a long time. As a matter of fact, the Democratic tradition in that part of the state really hangs on well into the mid-20th century. It goes back to the Civil War. There's the county that I'm from in eastern Ohio, proudly boasted until the days of Nixon that it never voted that it voted Democratic in every election since Jackson. So although it was a bastion of the radical Republican Party, it also was the location of a good many old Democrats and Southern sympathizers. So the issues of suffrage associated with the 14th and 15th Amendments were hotly debated here in the state of Ohio, as were the issues of whether or not proponents, politicians, opponents had a Civil War service. For example, when Hayes ran, the first time he ran against a man by the name of Alan Thurman, and one of the issues was whether Thurman had served in the war or not. Hayes felt was at a real advantage because he had the military service, Thurman didn't. So it was a state, while thought of as Republican, it was very divided, particularly on state and local issues. Hayes was seen as the candidate that could straddle that boundary between the radical Republicans, at least in his first term, between the radical Republicans and the more moderate wing of the Republican Party. That's one of the reasons he was selected to run the first time, felt that he was satisfactory to the radicals but also palatable to those who weren't members of the radical Republicans.
We're back at the Rutherford B. Hayes home, Presidential Center here in Fremont, Ohio, the 19th president. And we're going to take some calls for Ari Hogenboom and Roger Bridges. Later on, you're going to meet Tom Culbertson, who is inside this house, and will show us around a little bit in there. But first, before we take a call, I want to make sure that those of you who are teachers in the audience know that you can call us and join C-SPAN in the classroom and get some materials that might help you better teach this whole subject in the fall around the C-SPAN series. Our telephone number is 202-626-4858. That's 202-626-4858. Anyone wants to reach our C-SPAN Education Department today, you can call that number. Again, the number's on the screen, 202-626-4858, and there will be folks there to answer your questions and to send you materials as this program goes on for the rest of the morning. We have a call waiting for our two guests from Springfield, Ohio. Thank you very much for waiting. You're on the air.
Hi, good morning, gentlemen.
Go ahead, sir.
All right. My question is, I was wondering, what was Hayes' opinion on slavery? Also, did he have any Afro-American servants working for him at his home? And I like to thank C-SPAN for the series. I'm a historian, and I'm really do enjoy this series. Thank you.
Thanks. Mr. Bridges.
Yeah. Could I
Sure.
try that? You want to rephrase that again?
Well, first of all, did he have slaves, and what was his attitude toward the African Americans?
Right. He was, as a young man, as a boy, a young man, he really didn't care for abolitionism. He was anti-slavery, but when he married his wife, Lucy, Lucy was an abolitionist, and her father, Lucy's father, was from Kentucky and inherited slaves in Kentucky. And he died going to Kentucky to manumit to free those slaves. Her mother, her mother was advised, he didn't get around to freeing those slaves. Her mother was advised to sell the slaves so that she could bring up her two boys and Lucy in some degree of comfort. And she said, "I'll take in washing before I do that." And so so Lucy's family did free those slaves. Now, they maintained a very close connection with those former slaves, and the Hayes employed members of those families in their household in Cincinnati, in Fremont, and in the White House. The most famous one was named Winnie Monroe. And Lucy was very close to Winnie Monroe.
Tapiola, Michigan, next. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Yes, thank you for a wonderful series. My question is in regard to the Union Veterans Group known as the Grand Army of the Republic. What was their impact on Hayes' election and the subsequent elections of the latter part of the 19th century? Thank you.
Right, Roger Bridges.
Well, there's no question that the GAR had a tremendous impact on presidential elections and other elections throughout the last third of the 19th century. Hayes was an active member of the GAR and the Military Order of the Loyal Legion. He expected their support and received it, and I think it's quite likely that without the support of the GAR and his participation, he would have been not as successful.
Grand Rapids, Michigan, you're next. Go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you for taking my call, and enjoy this series so much. My question is about President Hayes' wife. I'm wondering if she is related to Brigadier General Alexander Webb.
Ari Hogenboom?
I don't know. Do you know, Roger?
I don't know that answer either, but our wonderful library staff could answer that question.
Yeah.
Take some time to talk about the involvement of this First Lady, and one of the things I want to ask you about is alcohol.
Oh. Well, in some of your material, you referred to Lemonade Lucy. Nobody ever called her that during the period they were in the White House. That's something that somebody cooked up years later. She was a teetotaler, and she was a member of a family. Got her to take the pledge when she was very young. She did not tolerate liquor in the home. Hayes himself drank moderately throughout his life until he became president. When he became president, after a state dinner, at which apparently some congressmen got in their cups, Hayes decided that he didn't want any liquor in the White House. He also did it for political reasons. He's a very sharp politician, although most people don't think that he was. And he banned liquor from the White House so that he would do something very visible to keep the prohibitionists within the Republican Party.
Let's go to St. Augustine, Florida. We'll talk about Mrs. Hayes a little bit more as we go on. Go ahead, please.
Hello, I'm from St. Augustine.
Yes, what would you like to ask us?
I just wanted to talk to Ari Hugenboom a second.
Go right ahead.
I know that he's the one that must have been the one that was at Atlantic Union College with me in 1946 and 7, was he not?
That is true, but I don't know who you are, but I was there.
Yes, I know you were. I got out your picture, and I noticed in the back that it says your major is history.
That's right.
I said that clinches it. It's got to be. Who else would be an Ari Hugenboom?
Do you know this man?
Yes, I do.
What is your name, if you don't mind telling us?
Eleanor Hill now, but it was Eleanor White. I was a pre-nursing student just there that 1 year.
Mm-hmm.
And I was there watching all the boys, of course.
Well, thanks for calling this morning. Let me ask the two of you, when she brings up the college years, where did you go, Roger Bridges, to college?
I went to what's now called the University of Northern Iowa to get my undergraduate and then master's degree and my PhD from the University of Illinois at Urbana.
Do you credit anybody in particular with getting you interested in history?
Absolutely. My undergraduate major, Leland L. Sage, was instrumental in interesting me in history, and particularly in pursuing it as a career.
How about you, Mr. Hogenbaum?
Well, you heard Atlantic Union College. I had two very good teachers there, an Albert W. Werlein and a Willis King. And I was interested in history because of, I guess, my mother and my sister beforehand. But they were very good history teachers. And then I went on to Columbia for a PhD.
We are in Fremont, Ohio at the Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Center. Our next call is Largo, Florida. Good morning.
Yes. I wanted to comment on the descendants of Rutherford B. Hayes. That is my great uncle. And I would like to thank you guys because he deserves all of the things that you've done for him.
Can you tell us how you're related to him?
My mother's maiden name is Hayes, and my grandmother was a niece of his.
How old are you?
I'm 14.
And when did you first get interested in Mr. Hayes?
I got interested in him 4 years ago.
What do you know about him?
I know that he was president from 1776 to 1781.
Well, thanks a lot for calling in this morning. Do you get many visitors here who are Hayes related?
We get a number of Hayes visitors. We get more who think they might be, but actually are not.
Go back to the year 1776. What was this country like then? How big was it?
Well, in 1876, there were 46 million people in the United States. And it was, of course, in 1876, Colorado, I believe, was admitted as the centennial state. And most of the country was there, but there were still states to be added.
You want to add anything to that, Professor?
Not really. Sounds about right.
Let's take a call from Hagerstown, Maryland. Good morning.
Good morning. I was curious. I had read once where in 1876, when Hayes was finally elected, that there was some danger or concern that northern and southern shots would be fired again. Is there any credibility to that?
Ari Hogenbaum?
Yeah, there were hotheads that talked in terms of Tilden supporters taking the government. There were fears of assassination at the time of the Hayes inauguration, and people breathed a sigh of relief when it didn't occur. There were some extra troops in Washington just in case there was a problem at the time of the inauguration. But most of the Democrats did not really, the Democratic leadership, responsible leaders in Congress were not really into another civil war. And the key Democrat, and unfortunately he's usually neglected by most historians, and this is Samuel J. Randall, who was the Speaker of the House. He was the one. He's really the key figure in the whole episode. That is of finally ending the big filibuster that prolonged the presidential count.
Auburn, Alabama, you're next. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Brian. Your introduction this morning said that Lucy Hayes was the first lady to be a college graduate. Where did she graduate from college? My guess would be Oberlin. And secondly, when he organized Ohio State University, did she insist that it be coeducational, which was rather unusual for state universities in those days?
Roger Bridges.
She graduated from the Cincinnati Female Seminary in Cincinnati. She did attend college classes at what is now Ohio Wesleyan, but that was an all-male school, and she could not receive her degree from there. As to whether or not she influenced Hayes in the matter of coeducation at Ohio State, I think that's unlikely.
Omaha, Nebraska. Go ahead, please.
Hi. First of all, I've been waiting for this for a long time, but I wanted to know about Guy Bryan's role in Hayes' administration, and why didn't Hayes appoint him to a position in the administration since he was from Texas? And lastly, what about Hayes' turn to socialism towards the end of his life?
Who was Guy Bryan, Mr.
Guy Bryan was a college friend, a warm college friend of Hayes. Hayes visited him in Texas in the winter of 1848, 1849, for that matter. They corresponded. They argued about slavery before the Civil War. They were not in contact with one another during the Civil War. Hayes asked every Texan he saw about Guy Bryan, but he found out very little. After the war, Hayes was instrumental in getting a pardon for Bryan. Bryan remained a Democrat. Bryan was reconstructed in a sense, but Bryan was very much opposed to black suffrage, which Hayes was very much in favor of, opposed to civil rights for blacks. And Hayes would not appoint him for those reasons. He kept open the personal relationship was still there, but they were quite far apart politically.
Roger Bridges, where was he born?
Rutherford B. Hayes was born in Delaware, Ohio.
Where's that from here?
It's about 70 miles south of Fremont, about 30 miles north of Columbus, Ohio.
And what kind of a place was he born in?
Well, he was born in we're not exactly sure, to tell you the truth. He could have been born in a small brick home, or he could have been born in a larger home, but he was born in one of two places in Delaware, Ohio. One of those places is now marked as a BP gas station. There's a monument there. The other place where he may have been born, and certainly where his home stood, is the site of the present Methodist Church in Delaware, Ohio. Both of them, incidentally, are on William Street.
Grand Blanc, Michigan, you're next.
Hello.
Hi, you're on the air.
All right. I was wondering, I bought a large painting of Rutherford B. Hayes when he was about 10 years old, and I bought it at an estate sale, and after I bought it, the person said that they accidentally sold the painting and that they would like to buy it back. I have no way of knowing if this is the original painting of him or not. Is there any way that I could verify this painting?
Roger Bridges.
Well, we would certainly be more than willing to take a look at it here in Fremont to see whether or not it appears to be a painting of Hayes, and from there you might want to talk to an expert at a nearby art museum.
I clocked about 80 miles on the car yesterday coming from the Cleveland Hopkins Airport. If you come across Route 80, Route 90, where it joins together at these points. How far is it from Toledo?
It's about 35 miles from Toledo, about 80 miles from Cleveland, both of those on Interstate 80, of course, and about 100 miles from Columbus.
And when people come to this area right here, this presidential center, besides this home with 33 rooms in it, what else can they see?
Well, of course, you can see the library and the museum here. You can also visit the lake if you want to. There are a number of historic sites in the area of interest, including the old turnpike, that is markings from the old turnpike between Lower Sandusky and Perrysburg, which are the original mile markers are still along Interstate or Highway 20.
We're going to take a call. It's a local call, and then we're going to meet Tom Culbertson and look inside this house and see what's there. Fremont, Ohio, you're next on the program. Go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to compliment Mr. Hogenboom for his excellent biography of Rutherford Hayes. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I think it may have set the record straight on a couple of issues. But my question is, what role did Rutherford's uncle Sardis Burchard play in his political career, if any?
Well, his uncle was responsible for his going to Harvard Law School. His uncle always did want him to be involved in public service. His mother didn't. His mother thought that politics would be the ruination of him ever since a relative, I guess it was a brother-in-law, became a drunkard in Washington, and a fellow named Noyes, John Humphrey Noyes' father. In any event, Sardis really encouraged Hayes' ambitions. Sardis is a good friend of Morrison Waite, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who later swore Hayes in as President of the United States. And there were those encouragements, and also Sardis's checkbook, as it were, was behind Hayes, because there was no money to be made in politics, and Hayes is upright. Sardis bankrolled his terms in a sense, his terms in the House and as governor of the state of Ohio.
Ari Hogenboom is our guest, along with Roger Bridges. Ari Hogenboom lives in the New York City area, and Roger Bridges lives right here. Brooklyn. You want that name out there, Brooklyn. And Roger Bridges has been at this Presidential Center for 11 years.
Right.
Prior to that, how many years in Springfield, Illinois?
I was 18 years in Springfield, Illinois, with what is now the Illinois Historic Preservation Agency.
How long did you teach at Brooklyn College?
30 years.
And are you retired now?
Yes.
Right. Are you writing another book?
Yes.
On what?
Gustavus Vasa Fox, Lincoln's Assistant Secretary of the Navy. It's a change of pace.
Before we go in and meet Tom Culbertson, let's go through a lot of little details about who Rutherford B. Hayes was. We've done some of this before, but let me go through this again for those who might have just joined us. First of all, where was he born?
He was born in Delaware, Ohio, on October 4th, 1822. His father had been dead already about 2.5 months.
How many years did he live?
Hayes lived until 1893. At the age of 70, he died of a heart attack right here in Spiegel Grove.
How much education did he have?
He had a bachelor's degree from Kenyon College. He got a Harvard Law degree from Harvard College, where he studied with Story and others, and Chitty. So he was well educated as lawyers go in those days. Very well educated.
What would this world be like if he hadn't been President of the United States for 4 years, Ari Hogenboom?
Well, the world would be pretty much the same. I mean, I can't make claims that he moved and shaped the world. He did really have an effect on the presidency. I think the roots of the modern presidency can be found in Hayes' administration, particularly in the development of the bureaucracy with the introduction of civil service reform, and also in the area of trying to restore some power and prestige to the executive through the use of the veto power, which he did, and gaining control over appointments, taking away from senators the idea of senatorial courtesy.
We're going to look around the grounds here with our cameras. We have some 8 cameras on scene. Today's program being directed by Gary Ellenwood, produced by Peter Slen. I want to ask, as we look around and see what this place looks like, Roger Bridges, what was his military career like?
Well, Hayes entered the Army as a major, as a 38-year-old major in 1861 from Cincinnati. He served mostly in West Virginia, and Maryland, rising to the rank of brevet major general at the time of his muster out. He was wounded at least 4 times, once quite seriously at the Battle of South Mountain, which prevented his being present for the Battle of Antietam.
In some ways, he could even 5 times. He was hit twice in one battle. But,
in 1876, he ran against Sam Tilden.
Yes.
Who was he?
New York lawyer, reformer in New York. A very tough candidate. Very astute political organizer, and an extremely hard candidate to beat.
He actually got how many more votes than Rutherford B. Hayes?
250,000.
Yeah.
How many more? What was the split on the
electoral vote? Was 385 to 384.
185 to 184.
Right,
yeah.
185 to 184. 20 votes were in dispute, which meant it could go either way. And unfortunately, the commission decided for Hayes.
And in the end, how many electoral votes did he have versus Samuel?
185 to 184.
185 in the very end.
Yeah, it had been
184 to
165.
Okay, that's what I meant, the difference.
Yeah.
All right, let me go inside and meet Tom Culbertson. We'll come back, and please keep your calls coming in as we go, because Mr. Culbertson is the historian here at the Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Center, and the house is right over here with 33 rooms, as we talked about earlier, and I hope Mr. Culbertson is inside waiting for us.
Hello, Brian.
Tom, how you doing?
Welcome to the retirement home of Rutherford and Lucy Hayes.
Where are we right here?
Right now we're in the entry hall of the Hayes home, and we're going to be looking here at Sardis Burchard, who was the gentleman they were just talking about out on the porch, who built the home in 1863. The home was actually built in 3 phases. 2 additions were put on by Rutherford and Lucy Hayes, one in 1880 and one in 1889. But Sardis was the gentleman who originally built the house, and as the gentleman on the porch said, was the financial backer of President Hayes.
And what is this room we're standing in right here?
We're moving into what's either called the drawing room or the library parlor of the Hayes home. This was added in 1880 when the Hayeses anticipated coming back from the White House. They needed larger rooms so they could entertain people. They also needed to accommodate this beautiful portrait. That explains the almost 13-foot ceilings here. Rutherford Hayes is painted in his full height of about 5'8.5" in that picture.
And you know, you can't tell on television right now because we have a close-up of it, but how big is this painting?
This painting is about 9 feet tall.
Who painted it?
It was William Garrell Brown painted it. The president posed for it in 1878 while he was in the White House, and don't ask me why his arm is in his coat. I know you've had that question before on segments, but it may be to hold up his pants. I'm not sure.
We have a call from, I believe it is, I can't see, Holly, Massachusetts. Is that it, Crystal? Where are you calling from?
Hawley, Massachusetts. This is for Professor Hugenboom. I wanted to ask him about his impression and valuation of C. Van Woodward's argument in Reunion and Reaction about the Compromise of 1877, whether Hayes was the individual who did end Reconstruction in the South, and whether the Compromise of 1877 was responsible for giving Hayes the presidency.
Okay, thanks. We can ask Mr. Hogenboom later, but do you have an answer to that, Tom Culberson?
The Compromise of 1877 is considered to be the deal that was made to award President Hayes the presidency. It's not an absolute given that this compromise happened. Hayes was not in on any negotiations. However, people, including James Garfield, were in on some negotiations, and Professor Hogenboom, I think, can give you a better explanation later.
Over there was a portrait we were looking at just a moment ago that
right,
Greg
that
Fabick
is,
was on. What is that?
That is Lucy Hayes in her 25th anniversary gown. The Hayeses celebrated the renewal of their vows in the White House on December 30th, 1877 for their 25th wedding anniversary, and that was the gown she wore that day. That painting was painted by E.F. Andrews, who did many of the portraits in this house.
We have a call from Genoa, Ohio. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. I have two questions that I'd like to ask. First of all, I'm curious about Rutherford Hayes' involvement in some local history. I know that he and his family were involved in securing the right-of-way for the current Route 20 between Fremont and Perrysburg, and I was wondering if Hayes was involved at all furthering the clearing of the swamp area that was here in the late 19th century. The second question I have is involved in his presidency, and I was wondering what further involvement Hayes had in the Reconstruction era beyond simply taking out the remaining occupying troops out of the South.
Mr. Culberson.
Okay, on the second question, President Hayes did pull the last troops off of the courthouse or the State House lawns in South Carolina and Louisiana. However, he vetoed a couple of very key bills that were Army appropriation bills, which were intended to not allow for the troops in the South to enforce voting laws. And so he was concerned about what was going on in the South and did try to get the Southerners to enforce voting laws. As far as the first question, Hayes had many land holdings in the Sandusky County area and the Wood County area, and he did help secure some right-of-ways for Route 20 and for some railroads.
What room are we in here?
Right now we're in the library of the Hayes home, which was President Hayes' favorite room. At the time he lived here, the walls were lined with books. He was an avid book collector, collected over 12,000 volumes in his lifetime. Right now we have the books of his oldest son, Burchard Hayes. All of President Hayes' books are cataloged and on shelves in the library so that scholars have access to them.
We have a call from Travers, Michigan. Go ahead, please, for Tom Culbertson. Hello, Travers, you're on the air.
Hello.
Go ahead, please.
I'm calling, and
about the Fannie Hayes doll houses. I certainly would love to see them. If you can take us up to the nursery to show them to us.
We're not planning to do that. Tell us what those are, Tom Culbertson.
The Fannie Hayes doll houses are actually over in the museum. They're in cases in the basement of the museum. Unfortunately, right now the museum is undergoing radical changes, and we don't have access to them. But they were given to Fannie while she was in the White House. One was built by a White House carpenter, and the other one was built for the Philadelphia Exposition in 1876 and was given to the daughter Fannie.
Where Greg Fabich's camera is, there is a table right there, and this has some significance, I understand.
This was President Hayes' writing table. He, after he got out of the presidency, he did not have a secretary. He carried on his own correspondence. He would come into the library every morning after the sun was up, do some correspondence for a couple of hours, take breakfast, and then come back and do some more writing before lunch. So he wrote many of his over 200 speeches that he did after his presidency on that very desk.
We have another call from Antioch, California. Go ahead, please.
Hi. I may be calling a little too late, but I was curious about in the initial biographical sketch that you gave at the beginning of the show, you said that Lucy Hayes was anti-slavery and also anti-suffrage. And somehow to me that seems intellectually contradictory. And I was wondering if they could explain why she held both of those views at the same time.
Well, I think that Lucy was more of a traditionalist and believed that intellectual pursuits should be left to the men, whereas on the abolitionist, it was a case of she believed in the right thing, and she believed in her Bible as a good Methodist. So yes, it does seem contradictory, and I have no great explanation for why it occurred.
Greg Faber's going to move into the dining room area in a moment, but we're standing out here where we've got, I don't know whether Darren can see this stairway here. When was this put in?
The stairway was put in 1880 when they added the addition off to the north. We have the original contract and bill for this. It was $825 to insert this into the existing home. It's made of butternut and walnut.
Tom Culbertson, you've been at this Hayes Presidential Center for how long?
I've been here for 11 years now.
Where'd you come from?
Well, I've actually lived in Fremont for 10 years prior to that, but I was a stockbroker. And before that, I was a college librarian out in Storm Lake, Iowa.
We have a call from Lanham, Maryland. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Yes, good morning. Earlier, there was the reference to prison reform, and I'm with the American Correctional Association. And in 1870, when he was governor of Ohio, President Hayes founded the National Prison Association, which was the forerunner of our organization, and we just wanted to have that noted in the discussion.
Thanks.
Yes, President Hayes was very active in prison reform and an officer in the American Correctional Association. In fact, they had their board meeting here 2 years ago and took note of President Hayes' activities in the field.
What's in this room?
All right, they're looking right now at the dining room table, which was purchased by the Hayeses in 1887. Prior to the construction of this room in 1889, it would seat 24 people when all 11 leaves are placed in it. And as I said, this portion of the house was added in 1889. Lucy Hayes died during the construction of this phase, so she never saw the completed dining room, nor the kitchen, or the bedrooms upstairs. I think Greg is positioning himself to look at the sideboards which came from the White House. These were purchased for the Hayeses by William Crump at a excess inventory sale of the White House in 1882, conducted by William Crump, who was their steward in the White House, and he thought the Hayeses would like these. Mr. Crump was amazed by the prices they were getting for these items. He was saying that they were getting 3 times what they're worth, and he netted the grand total of $2,275 for a bunch of what they considered to be useless White House material. But these date all the way back to the Monroe administration.
If you've just joined us, we're at the Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Center. If you're an educator, we want you to get involved with us, C-SPAN in the classroom. And the telephone numbers will be on the screen for you teachers who want to call and join. There's no cost. There will be no cost in the future to this. And the number to dial, and we've got additional operators on working on today so that you can get in and don't get a busy signal. It's 202-626-4858, 202-626-4858. Call us, email us, and we'll get you involved. A lot of teachers have joined as this series has gone on. We're at the 19th stop of 41 before the year's over. We have a call for Tom Culbertson from Boston. Go ahead, Boston. You're on the air.
Yes, good morning. Thank you very much for taking my call. I believe Hayes was president during what was called the Gilded Age. When was that, and why was it called that? And also, 1877, during his presidency, I believe there was a war with the Nez Perce Indians, Chief Joseph. What was Hayes' view of that, and what was his relationship with Abraham Lincoln?
Gilded Age, Tom Culbertson.
Gilded Age was a phrase coined by Mark Twain in a book that he co-wrote. And the period is roughly from the Grant administration up to the turn of the century. And it's because of the rise of American industrialism and the concentration of wealth.
Would I then conclude from looking at the China from the White House days that they spent a lot of money on this?
Yes, a lot of money was spent on this White House China set. There are 74 different designs of flora and fauna of the United States, designed by Theodore R. Davis, who was an illustrator for Harper's Weekly. This set is either loved by people or hated by people, but it was one of the few examples that the Democrats could come up with for excessive spending by Rutherford Hayes.
What about Abe Lincoln and his relationship to Rutherford Hayes?
Hayes crossed paths with Lincoln a couple of times in the late 1850s, and just before Lincoln took office, he admired Lincoln very much. Thought he was an able leader, especially in wartime, and felt that he eclipsed George Washington as the greatest president, although he certainly thought that Washington was admirable too.
We have a call from Portland, Maine. Go ahead, Portland, Maine. You're on the air.
Yes, I'm interested in the Hayes papers. I assume they're there at the library, but could you talk about the size of them and the breadth of them, and how come, or are they part of the National Archives system, and how come they being in the Library of Congress? Thank you.
Tom Culbertson.
Okay, yes, the Hayes manuscripts are here at the museum in the archives. We have over 1 million pieces of paper in the archives. Not all of them are President Hayes's. Prior to Richard Nixon, the papers of the presidents were the personal property of the president. They could do whatever they wanted to with them. In the case of the Hayeses, they anticipated this institution, boxed them up. We still have the boxes up in the attic here. We have them arranged chronologically. They're all cataloged. If people want to come in and use them, they are certainly welcome to. They don't need an appointment. And we're open 9 to 5 Monday through Saturday, every day but Sunday and major holidays.
Where are we now?
We are now in the master bedroom where President and Lucy Hayes slept. They also both, unfortunately, died in this room. Lucy died here in 1889 and Rutherford in 1893, 3 years later.
How big is that bed?
It's a full-size bed. It doesn't look like it, but it was adequate for 2 relatively small people. And this was furnished much as it was when they were here in the 1880s, although the wallpapers changed.
What is this? What is this stuff right here?
Okay, this is one of Rutherford's frock coats. He was an avid cane collector. This is one of the canes from his collection, and one of Lucy's shawls sitting there also.
Let me take a call from Birmingham, Alabama next. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Good morning, Brian. Thank you for C-SPAN. I've visited many of these presidential homes over the years, and I'm enjoying sort of this retrospective tour that you're providing me with. And my question is regarding Fannie Hayes, the only daughter of the Hayeses. There's a cemetery near Spiegel Grove where you can find all of the President and Mrs. Hayes' children, except for Webb, who is buried with the President and Mrs. Hayes, and all of the the daughters-in-laws are there. However, Fanny's husband is not there, and I was wondering whatever happened to Fanny Hayes' husband.
Stay on the line if you would just a moment. I want to come back and ask you some questions. Tom Culbertson?
Okay, yes, Fanny was married but was divorced in 1919, I believe, so that would explain why he's not buried there. He remarried, and we have run across his descendants also. Fanny died in 1950 in Maine and was brought back here and buried with all of her brothers.
Birmingham, Alabama, why are you so interested and know so much about the details of the families?
When I was very young, President Kennedy was assassinated, and my father was so moved by the event that we jumped in the car and drove down to Washington, D.C. to participate in the funeral. And this piqued my interest in presidents, and I'm originally from Cleveland, and we drove out to the Rutherford B. Hayes Library, and at that time the home was not open, and the director was a gentleman named Mr. Watt P. Marchman, and he seemed to understand my great interest in my beginning interest in presidents, and was kind enough to take me on sort of a private tour, my mother, father, and I, of the house where you're walking through right now, and the stacks in the presidential library. And from there, my family and I just began an adventure over the last 30 years, visiting quite a few of the homes and libraries and graves, and we're enjoying the series very much.
Thank you for calling. We got one more call, then we're going to take a break from Maryfield, Virginia, near Washington. Go ahead, please. You're on with Tom Culbertson.
Good morning. How are you? My
Good.
question might be a little more, I don't know what the word is, but Rutherford B. Hayes, when he won the election under 1876, he sort of did it under a cloud, because Governor Tilden of New York won the popular vote. He got more electoral votes, but not enough to win. And it threw the election into Congress and then into a special commission. And many people believe Rutherford B. Hayes really shouldn't have been president, but Governor Tilden of New York. And I was wondering what Mr. Culbertson's reaction is to this, and how generally how he feels.
Tom Culbertson?
Well, the Samuel Tilden did get approximately 200,000 more popular votes than President Hayes. When the initial electoral votes were tallied, it was quickly realized that 25 votes were in dispute, and that if Rutherford Hayes could get all of those votes, he could win the election by one vote. It was thrown into the Electoral Commission, which had 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats. The 8 Republicans always voted to award the votes to President Hayes, and the Democrats voted to award them to Tilden. So Hayes won by one vote. Hayes then got a couple of names like his fraudulency and old 8-7.
Did they actually call him your fraudulency to his face, or in the newspapers back then?
Those would be in the newspapers of the day. Newspapers back then were much more partisan than today. If you were a Democrat, you bought a Democratic newspaper. If you were a Republican, you bought a Republican newspaper, and you expected to hear or see what you wanted to see.
I have a final question for you. There was a period in your life where you worked for Prudential Beach.
Right.
Selling stocks?
Yes.
And how many years?
10 years.
Why did you leave that business to come to this?
This was my first love, and so when an opportunity opened up here, I took it.
Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in Moline, Illinois, and St. Louis, Missouri, although my mother is a native of Fremont. And I came back here to work in family business with my father.
How many years have you been here now?
I've been in town for 20 years and at the Hayes Center for 11.
You credit anybody in particular with getting you interested in history?
I'd say Professor Rodney Davis of Knox College, who was also a colleague of Roger Bridges out on the porch, and a couple of history teachers back in high school.
Tom Culbertson, thank you. We're going to continue our discussion about Rutherford B. Hayes here at the Presidential Center after we take a short break.
Come on, jolly boys in gray and blue, my boys in blue, we'll clasp the hand all o'er the land for guarantees and we're a truth. For north and south, for east and west, I'll float the flag that's over us. Hurrah for Hayes and honest ways, with millions in the chorus. The men we want are on the flag, still true and trust confiding. There's not a truth and not a place corruption's tool has raised. Hurrah for Hayes and honest ways. Their wit and don't forget it. Come on, you jolly boys in gray and blue, my boys in blue. We clasp the hand all over the land for guarantees and we're a truth. From north and south, for east and west, we'll float the flag that's over us. Hurrah for Hayes and honest ways, with millions in the chorus. The men we want are on the flag, still true and trust confiding. There's not a truth and not a place corruption's tool has raised. Hurrah for Hayes and honest ways. Their wit and don't forget it. Come on, you jolly boys in gray and blue, my boys in blue. We clasp the hand all over the land for guarantees and we're a truth. From north and south, for east and west, we'll float the flag that's over us. Hurrah for Hayes and honest ways, with millions in the chorus. Hurrah for Hayes and honest ways.
Welcome back to Fremont, Ohio, and the Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Center. That's called Spiegel Grove, that house that you're looking at. Roger Bridges, who runs this place. Spiegel Grove got its name from what?
It was named by Sardis Burchard. It means mirror in German. There were lots of puddles around whenever it rained. They didn't go away very fast, and so you could see yourself as you walked through the grove. But of course, it was also reminded of German fairy tales and the spirits.
Ari Hogenboom has written a book about Rutherford B. Hayes. He's with us also, and we're going to take a call in a moment. But the Supreme Court appointments of President Hayes amounted to what?
Well, he appointed two, and the most outstanding one was John Marshall Harlan, who served for many years, until 1911. One of the great justices of the Supreme Court, noted really for his dissents in antitrust cases. He was in favor of federal regulation when the court overturned the regulation of trusts, and he was also in favor of the Civil Rights Act when the court overturned the Civil Rights Act of 1875.
And in my lifetime, there's been a John Marshall Harlan. Who's that?
Yeah, he's related to him, and I'm sorry, I don't know the precise relation. Do you know that, Roger?
I do not
Roger?
know. I do not know.
Roger Bridges, William Wheeler, the vice president, came from where?
William Wheeler came from New York, upstate New York. He was a Republican. It's reported that he asked whether or not he should take the job because vice presidents were lost to history. Hayes assured him he would not be, but of course we know that that is the fate of vice presidents. He was a frequent guest in the Hayes home, particularly on Sunday nights.
Did he have a background in politics?
He was a congressman when he was selected as Hayes vice president.
Let's take a call from Gloucester City, New Jersey. Go ahead, please. You're on with Ari Hogenboom and Roger Bridges.
Good morning. I'm a graduate student in American history at the Camden, New Jersey campus of Rutgers University, and I'm researching President Hayes' vetoes of racially based legislation, particularly appropriation bills with riders to limit federal supervision of Southern elections so black voters could participate, and also his veto of the exclusion bill to end Chinese immigration to the United States. My questions are, did Hayes constitute a presidential profile and courage by casting those vetoes? Was he criticized for doing so? And secondly, do you think that Hayes was ahead of his time in being right on the issue of equality for all Americans, regardless of race?
Ari Hogenboom.
Yeah, he was burned in effigy for his veto of the Chinese exclusion bill. But he did proceed with negotiations which allowed for the restriction of Chinese immigration. So, in a sense, the Hayes the record isn't as great as we would perhaps wish on that issue, but he was not in favor of total exclusion. On the other part of the question was there's a two-part.
Roger Bridges.
Well, certainly Hayes did was, if not ahead of his time, certainly agreed with those radicals in Congress earlier who believed that African Americans should be protected in their right to vote and the other rights of citizenship.
Yeah, I would argue that he was actually on the cusp, that he was a bit ahead of his time in terms of equal rights. He loved to say that he believed he came from this section of Ohio which is exceedingly flat, and he liked to think of it as level topography, level society here in Ohio.
If you've just joined us, we're about 80 miles from the Cleveland airport and a little bit closer to the Toledo airport up in the northern part of the state of Ohio, right near the Interstate 80. Also, we're on the property where Rutherford B. Hayes and his wife Lucy Webb Hayes are buried, along with one of his sons. He had 8 children, one female, one daughter. And one of the interesting things we learned at the beginning of this is that the gates at the opening of the Presidential Center actually were the gates of the White House back during the time that Rutherford B. Hayes was president. Next call, Washington, D.C. Go ahead, please.
Hi, I'm actually from Cleveland, Ohio, although I'm calling from Washington, D.C. And I had one question that was indirect and the other two were specific. Because I'm from Ohio, I was told that we had a number of presidents from our state, and I wanted to know who were the other ones other than Grant and Hayes, and what were their numbers in the presidency? And my second question was, because Hayes was a general in a war, I wanted to know if he ever wrote anything on what his position was on war in general, as well as the wars that he was specifically in.
All right, thank you. I remember doing a series a couple years ago at this network called the Ohio 8, and we stretched it a bit. They're not all buried here, they weren't all born here, but they all passed through here in one way or the other. Explain the Ohio presidents.
Well, that's right. We do claim 8 presidents, beginning with William Henry Harrison. The next one is Ulysses S. Grant, who was the 18th president. Hayes, of course, is the 19th. James Garfield from Mentor, Ohio, is the 20th. Benjamin Harrison was the 22nd. And then I lose track of the numbers, but we also had William Howard Taft, and finally Warren G. Harding. Of course, I forgot McKinley, who in fact served in the same regiment as Hayes did during the Civil War, the only regiment to have 2 presidents of the United States serving in that single regiment.
His attitude toward war?
He, like many warriors, he did not want the country to go to war when he was president of the United States. He was a man of peace after the war. But when he was involved in the Civil War, he really regarded it as a crusade. Initially saved the Union, but very, very quickly regarded slavery as the cause of disunion, and he wanted to end it, and he regarded it very much as a crusade. And so he was ardently in favor of the war. The war almost became, he was passionate about it. It almost became a religion to him.
Las Cruces, New Mexico, next. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Mr. Lamb. Marvelous program, marvelous series. Thank you so much.
Welcome.
To my old friend Ari Hogenboom, greetings from this part of the country that you and Olive abandoned so precipitously some years ago. John Bloom here. You remember my interest is in the Mexican War.
That's right.
Checked, and I did not find that Rutherford Hayes served in the Mexican War. How then did he qualify to be a major in 1861?
Well, you know, I recognize John's voice. I've only seen him intermittently from the 40 years ago that we served together at Texas Western College, and I'm just delighted to hear his voice. John is an expert on the Mexican War. Hayes wanted to go to war in Mexico, but he really was not healthy at the time. He probably had tuberculosis. He stoutly denied that he had tuberculosis, but he could not really get medical clearance to go to war in Mexico, and there was a big disappointment for him. As far as being a major, that was from pulling political wires. It was a political appointment. He had connections. and so he was able to get the appointment as major in the 23rd Ohio.
Next call comes from California. Tell us the name of your town, please.
Magalia.
Welcome. What would you like to say this morning?
I asked Mr. Hugenboom to comment a couple of questions I have about the disputed electoral count. I understand at the time that there were unusual tensions in the joint session, and there were actually armed troops present at the counting, and that some state governors threatened to send National Guard to Washington if Tilden was overturned. And at the actual count, there were some shouts of shoot 'em, but nothing happened. And also on the compromise of 1877, I understand that the alleged deal, of course, involved pulling the Union troops out of the South, and there's something about a promise to build a railroad through the South to Texas. I'll listen to him on the air.
Thanks, and both of you can jump in on this.
Okay, as far as the as armed guards present, I don't believe so. But but there's a lot of turbulence. In fact, the last session, there's incredible turbulence in the House with people jumping. It's in Garfield's diary. Garfield talks about a member of the House jumping up on his desk and screaming, trying to get the attention of Speaker of the House Randall. At that point, they wanted to recess. The filibusters wanted to recess. They wanted to prolong the count. They wanted a chaos. And Randall just simply refused to entertain their motions for recess and just forced the House to stay in session so that the count was completed. So there was a good deal of violent talk, but I don't think there was any real threat of violence. Bargains, there was a lot of negotiations. There were negotiations over the withdrawal of troops. There were negotiations over a land grant for the Texas and Pacific Railroad. Some people, William Henry Smith, thought that lobbyists controlled a number of congressmen. In the end, I'm convinced that this has been overdone, that the bargaining has been overdone, that the count would have been completed on time had there been no bargainers at all. In fact, the bargainers did not control the filibusters. It was Randall again. I mentioned Samuel J. Randall. Randall is the man that stopped the debate and forced the final count.
Roger Bridges, who controlled the House and the Senate when Rutherford B. Hayes was elected?
Well, the Democrats were in control of
both houses,
of the House and the Senate, I believe. The Republicans still controlled the Senate.
Yeah.
But with regard to the withdrawal of troops, I think it's safe to say that deal had already been done before the election. It was just a question of Hayes following through on what Grant had agreed to do. Hayes thought he had assurances from Southern governors that the rights of African Americans would be protected, and in that he was sadly disappointed and deceived.
Next call, we go to Traverse City, Michigan. Go ahead, Traverse City, you're on the air.
Good morning. It's nice to be retired and be able to watch your early morning show like this live. I have a question concerning a summer home. I live up in northwestern Michigan, and I've heard rumors for 35 years that Rutherford B. Hayes had a summer home in a small community near us called Fife Lake, and I wondered if either of these gentlemen knew anything about this.
Mr. Hogenboom.
I didn't hear that because my earplug was not functioning.
Did you hear Roger Bridges?
I did hear that, and I don't know about the home in northern Michigan. I do know that he had a home on Mouse Island in Lake Erie, a summer home that he visited.
Let me ask the two of you, let's say a stranger came and spent 2 hours having a dinner or a lunch with Rutherford B. Hayes, never met him before, what would you walk away concluding about the man from what you know of him?
First of all, you would meet a man who was extremely erudite, an extremely interesting conversationalist, a man who certainly believed in being tolerant of differences, but felt very strongly about issues like civil service reform, like the role of veterans in society. He was he did believe in reforming society and making it a better world.
But was he personable? Was
Very. He had a good sense of humor. He was very likable. In fact, he once said that if he set out to be friendly with somebody, which he usually did, which he almost always did, that he would make friends with people. People liked Rutherford. The only person he really had an abiding hatred for was Roscoe Conkling. He hated Conkling.
Who was he?
Senator from New York, who opposed Hayes in Hayes' administration. He was a Republican. He hated Conkling more than he hated any Democrat.
What ballot was he chosen on, and how many people ran against him at the Republican convention?
There were about 6 candidates, including Hayes, and they all kind of knocked one another off. Blaine was too corrupt.
James G. Blaine?
James G. Blaine was too corrupt. Morton of Indiana was too radical. Hartranft of Pennsylvania was a favorite son from a state that the Republicans carry anyhow. Bristow, Benjamin H. Bristow of Kentucky, was too much of a reformer. I don't know if I've covered them all, but anyhow, they all were too extreme. Hayes was everybody's second choice. He was the available man.
Do you remember what ballot he was chosen on, Roger?
I do not. I think it was the sixth or seventh.
Smithfield, North Carolina. Go ahead, please. Thanks for waiting.
Yes, Brian, I'm really enjoying the program. A few minutes ago, you talked about the relationship between the first John Marshall Harlan and the second one. The first John Marshall Harlan was the grandfather of the second one that was appointed in 1955 by President Eisenhower, then served until 1971.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
When Rutherford B. Hayes was wounded in the Civil War, you said how many times, Roger Bridges?
Well, 4 or 5 times, depending on how you count.
What was his most severe wound?
His most severe wound was a wound to the arm at the Battle of South Mountain, which just preceded the Battle of Antietam. He was so badly injured there that he was reported to have died, but he eventually did some recovery in Middletown, Maryland, and then came back to Fremont to recover before he returned to the war. Lucy, in fact, spent several days looking for him, not knowing whether he was alive or dead.
Montpelier, Vermont, next. Good morning.
Good morning. I just wanted to answer the same question the gentleman just answered about Judge Harlan, that he was a grandson of the one appointed by President Hayes. But I'll also say Harlan was a very important judge because he was the one that voted against the Ferguson decision. The preceding Ferguson decision. So he was a very important Supreme Court judge.
Yeah. Thanks. What was the Plessy versus Ferguson decision?
It's the separate but equal decision of the Supreme Court, and Harlan said that you can't be separate and be equal at the same time. In other words, it's a segregation. The decision upheld segregation, and John Marshall Harlan took a stand against segregation.
Do you remember the vote? Were there 9 members on the court then?
Yes, but I don't really remember the vote.
North Tustin, California. You're next.
Yeah, my question is about what is the dispute about the 1876 election, and what are the merits of that dispute?
Roger Bridges.
Well, the dispute was over 20 votes. In South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana.
Electoral votes.
Electoral votes, whether or not the returning boards there had counted the votes correctly, or whether they had thrown out votes that should not be counted. The Democratic governors and returning board members certified the Democrats, Republican returning boards, when they went over the ballots, threw out enough Democratic votes to make Hayes the winner. As Ari said earlier, it's difficult to know the exact truth because there was so much violence and fraud in those 3 states that it's quite likely, quite probable, had all of the African Americans been able to vote, Hayes would have carried those states.
All right, let's go back. Let me ask you the setup on this again. 1876, the Civil War was over for how many years then?
Well, it would be 11 years.
What was the mood in the country?
Depression. There was a severe economic downturn following the Panic of 1873. people were really concerned about bread and butter issues rather than concerned about keeping the Republican Party alive in the South.
How many states were there in the Union?
Oh, now that's a little tough for me to answer. You have
I think 37.
And when the election was held, Samuel Tilden beat popular vote by 250,000, Rutherford B. Hayes.
Right.
He had, again, how many electoral votes?
It was Hayes had 165 uncontested. Tilden had 184 uncontested. 20 votes, one odd vote from Oregon, which is a special case, but 19 from South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida.
Who was responsible, Roger Bridges, for appointing the 15-member commission?
This was a result of a resolution of Congress that was appointed by Congress.
So it was a Democratic Congress?
Democratic House, Republican Senate.
5 members were appointed by what party?
5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, and allegedly 5 independent Supreme Court justices. But of course we know originally there were 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, and the 5th, David Davis, was assumed to be independent.
How did James Garfield get on that commission?
He was appointed by the by the Speaker of the House,
and he went on to be the next president.
No, Garfield wanted to be the next Speaker of the House.
No, but he went on to be the next president.
He did go on.
Hayes, yes.
Yeah, but Garfield was slated to be, and oddly enough, Garfield was one of the visiting statesmen in Louisiana. So if this is going to, if the commission was going to be judicious, to have a guy who participated in throwing out votes in Louisiana as a member of the commission that's going to consider the act that he committed in Louisiana, you're really into a political solution.
Now, you mentioned David Davis. Was he, in the end, was he a member of the commission?
No. David Davis was elected senator from Illinois. David Davis was, he was an old friend of Lincoln's, and but at this point he was an
manager
independent.
in 1860?
And,
yes.
60 or 64?
60.
And he was terribly ambitious, wanted to become president, and he was not satisfied to be Supreme Court justice. So when he had an opportunity to become a senator from Illinois, he didn't mind having his hat in the ring. And the Democrats, Tilden's nephew in particular, made a terrible mistake in getting Democrats to support Davis, because Tilden's nephew thought that Davis could therefore be bought, that if the Democrats made Davis a senator from Illinois, Davis would reciprocate on the commission and would put Tilden in the White House. Davis resigned from the commission. He was glad to get out of having to make that decision.
Let's go to Delaware, Ohio for our next call, where Rutherford B. Hayes was born. Go ahead, Delaware, you're on the air.
Yes, sir. I have a question in regards to just what you were talking about. I understand I was in Washington just last year, and they took us through I believe, the Red Room. And they were talking about how President Grant actually ordered the early inauguration or swearing in of Hayes before the actual inauguration day. I just want to know what the factors were involved in making that decision, and then were they really that paranoid about something that might happen?
Thanks. And first of all, in 1877, Inauguration Day was
March 4th.
Was on March 4th, and it would have been on a Sunday. And so, because they didn't do inaugurations on Sunday in those days, and just to ensure that there would not be any question about whether or not there was an interregnum, Hayes slipped into the Red Room and was sworn in by Morrison, I believe, on the evening of March 3rd. And of course, the official inauguration did take place on Monday, March 5th.
Again, Ari Hogenboom, why was he only a one-term president?
He was a reformer, and there was the idea, then very current, that a president, if a president tried to serve a second term, he'd be using his second term, most of his first term, trying to get reelected for a second term, and he would commit himself and make bad political decisions. The one-term principle was widely regarded as a reform principle. It would free the president from political considerations. I think it was a terrible mistake on his part, because he couldn't follow through on anything.
Roger Bridges runs this presidential center, has for the last 11 years here in Fremont, Ohio. Ari Hogenboom has taught for most of his life, is now a retired emeritus professor at Brooklyn College, and has written a book on Rutherford B. Hayes. And educators around the country, we have for you C-SPAN in the Classroom membership, free of charge to you, and we have a telephone number we want you to know about. You can call now, and folks will sign you up, and it will provide you with some materials for the rest of this series. There'll be a lot more coming out before the year is over. The number on the screen is 202-626-4858, and it's cspan.org/classroom. For those who want to join our C-SPAN in the Classroom effort, you can dial right now, and there are plenty of operators standing by somewhere in this country to take those calls and to sign you up. Sounds like we're selling what? It's the shopping channel here, the political shopping channel. It doesn't cost you a penny.
Ginzu knives.
It's hard to believe. It doesn't cost you anything. The museum is closed because of renovation right now and new air conditioning. Can people see when they, and we have a camera over there to show them if they come visit?
Well, when the museum opens, of course, you can see material from the Hayes administration. You'll see inauguration paraphernalia. You see the carriage that he bought when he became president. You'll see artifacts from the Civil War. Here you, in fact, are seeing some portions of the diorama which have been removed while we're doing the renovation. You'll be able to see such things as 6 of Lucy's dresses. You'll see knives from the White House. You'll see gold and silver that was given to Hayes during his trip to the West in 1880, the first president to do so. You will see all kinds of artifacts.
When is this going to be reopened so the public can actually visit?
We expect to reopen about September 1.
What's the cost of visiting both the house and the museum?
To visit the house and the museum, there's a cost of $7.50. You can visit either singly for $4, and we have senior citizen and student discounts.
Beaverton, Oregon, you're next. Go ahead, please. Hello, Beaverton, you're on the air. Hello, Beaverton. Let's go on to Nantucket, Massachusetts. Nantucket, you're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Hello. I'm still fascinated by this Electoral Commission because if the Democrats did indeed control both houses of Congress, how was it that the tie-breaking, supposedly independent member always voted for the Republicans?
Harry Hogenboom.
Actually, the Democrats control the House of Representatives. The Republicans control the Senate.
It changed then when he became president?
No. During his first 2 years, Hayes had the Senate. The Republicans had the Senate. The Senate disagreed with him a great deal, actually. The Democrats had the House. Last 2 years of his administration, the Democrats controlled both Senate and House. So the commission was evenly divided between 3 Democrats from the House, 2 Republicans from the House, 3 Republicans from the Senate, 2 Democrats from the Senate, 2 Democratic Supreme Court justices, 2 Republican Supreme Court justices, and initially, supposedly at the beginning, 1 independent Supreme Court justice, David Davis, who resigned or who never served, refused to serve, and replaced by Joseph P. Bradley, a Republican from New Jersey. Therefore, 8-7 political majority in favor of the Republicans on the commission. And they decided the election, well, you can say on partisan grounds. You can also say they made the wise decision not to go behind the official returns that came in, no matter what kind of violence or intimidation had occurred on the part of the Democrats or fraud had occurred on the part of the Republicans.
We have several minutes to go here, and we're going to take a walk over to the gravesite in a few minutes. But our cameras are walking around this whole facility that's under construction right now, and we want to thank John Bell, who works with Roger Bridges, and his staff, who have pitched in this morning to help us move cables around and made this place habitable for our C-SPAN bus and crew, which is here for this day and then moves on to Mentor, Ohio, where the James Garfield home for our next presidential program, which is the 20th president. There you can see the outside of the museum. Danielle Hill is on the line. She is at Delaware High School, and actually it's named after Rutherford B. Hayes, and it's in Delaware, Ohio. Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
How did your school get named after Rutherford B. Hayes?
I have, from what I hear, he was born here in Delaware, and I guess they wanted to name it after one of the presidents other than Willis because that's our middle school.
What do you know about Rutherford B. Hayes?
I know that when he was born, the welfare cost for the childbirth was only $3.50, which is weird because nowadays it costs a whole of a lot more. And at the age of 7, he was finally allowed to play outside. And at the age of 9, he was able to play sports. However, he wasn't well liked among other kids his age.
Do you have any idea why he wasn't liked?
Because he kept a diary and of his dreams, and he had a lot of self-confidence, and he was steadfast.
Have you read the diary?
Yes, actually, there's a website on the internet that I got. You could take a look at all the diaries and all the entries that he's written, along with the letters that he's written.
Ari Hogamoon, what are you hearing that you want to comment on?
Oh, I think the kids liked him. He got along well with kids his own age. He played in rough sports. You know, when his mother finally relented, and see, his mother had lost a lot of kids. His older brother had fallen through the ice and had drowned, and his mother was terribly protective. And she finally let him go out and play sports. And he swam and he hunted. He did a lot of hunting as a boy and played in rough sports. And he played in rough sports when he was at Harvard in law school. His fingers got all bruised from playing ball. And he enjoyed ball play. And he'd like to have his boys play ball, too. He thought baseball's a manly sport.
Danielle Hill, is there anything in your high school, like a statue or a picture of Rutherford B. Hayes?
Actually, we have 2 cardboard cutouts of Rutherford and Lucy, and we take them to a lot of the different functions, like the field trips and that we go on.
What do you call, what's the nickname for your school?
We call it Hayes, is our only nickname that we really have for it.
And what year are you?
I'm a senior. I'll be graduating this year in 2000.
And when the last 3 years you've been at the school, has anybody ever teach you about who Rutherford B. Hayes was?
No, not really.
How big is your school?
Geez, that's a good question. I have no idea. It's got about, I want to say 1,500 students. It's not very big.
How did you get picked this morning to tell us about Hayes High School in Delaware?
Okay, for my journalism class last year, I wrote an article on Rutherford B. Hayes, and for my class.
Okay. Thank you very much for joining us, and good luck.
I was going to say, I went to John Adams High School, and they never taught me anything about John Adams in my high school in New York City. So I think it's fairly
I had the same experience at Thomas Jefferson High School. Actually, we didn't call it Thomas Jefferson, just Jefferson High School. How about you, Roger Bridges? What was the name of your school?
I went to a very small high school, fewer than 100 in the high school, and we didn't have a name, just a town school.
Let's go to Monmouth Junction, New Jersey next. Go ahead, please.
Hi, first of all, I'd like to say hello to Professor Hugenboom. I'm a former student of his at Brooklyn College. I took his American history course there, and it was a wonderful course, and he was a wonderful teacher. My question is regarding Hayes. Did he feel any unease about the fact that he received 250,000 votes less than his opponent? Did he express any concern about that?
No, I was going to say no, he didn't. He didn't really feel any uneasy about it because he felt that in any kind of a fair election that he would have had a majority of votes. He felt that the Democratic violence and intimidation kept so many black Republicans from the polls in the South that he felt that he would have carried Mississippi. He felt he would have carried North Carolina. And Tennessee as well, I believe, as well as the states that later were counted for him. He didn't have. He thought initially that he had lost the election, but he thought he had lost the election because of fraud, of violence.
Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, you're next. Hello, Myrtle Beach, you're on the air.
Hello. Good. I want to comment on the Ohio Regiment. I believe at one time Rutherford B. Hayes was in command of that regiment. Is that correct?
The 23rd.
23rd, yes. All right. They were in a campaign in West Virginia, and the article I read by a historian claimed that there were at that time 3 future presidents from Ohio. And the 2 you've named
plus there was one third one which I can't remember, but he named all three, were serving in that regiment at that time in a campaign in West Virginia.
Thanks, caller. Roger Bridges, you're shaking your head.
There were only 2 presidents in that regiment, which is a good many for any regiment. There were future congressmen, future governors, future Supreme Court justice. So it was a regiment that fulfilled really Abraham Lincoln's comments that any regiment could provide leaders of the United States.
Who was the Supreme Court justice?
Salmon
Chase?
No, it was not Salmon Chase.
Was it Oliver Wendell Holmes?
No.
We play this game forever.
No, I don't know who that would be.
I don't remember offhand.
I'll bet you a caller does. Tracy, California, go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Thank you. Mr. Bridges, I thoroughly enjoyed my visit to the beautiful Spiegel Grove and the museum 5 years ago. One of my special delights was discovering a Hall of Presidents on the lower floor of the museum. I was surprised to learn that Hayes and Chester Arthur buried the hatchet by riding together for 5 hours in the General Grant funeral procession of 1885, and Hayes had enjoyed his ride with Arthur. I was pleased to see this mentioned in Mr. Hogaboom's well-researched book. I also wanted to mention the Hayes connection with the current Kennedy tragedy. That was his desk he received from Queen Victoria, which the famous photograph of JFK and John Jr. has been shown constantly this weekend. Also, I have one question. My question is, which modern presidents have paid a visit to Spiegel Grove and the museum? Keep up the good work, C-SPAN. Thank you.
That's a question I was going to ever ask here, and our callers never let us down. Who's been here?
Well, the last president to visit Spiegel Grove was Warren G. Harding, and before that it was William Howard Taft. Other presidents have visited here, and we have trees named for them, of course.
How long did Rutherford B. Hayes live in this house?
He lived in this house from 1873 until his death in 1893.
How many other Hayes descendants continue to live here?
Well, there were 4 additional generations of Hayes who lived here. His son, Webb Cook Hayes, his grandson, Webb Hayes II, and his great-grandson, Webb Hayes III, who just died recently in Washington, D.C.
When was this house turned over to a public viewing?
In 1965, although throughout its early history, visitors were often brought through the home.
New Orleans, Louisiana, you're next. Go ahead, please.
For years, I think.
Did we lose New Orleans? Yeah. Are you still there, New Orleans? We go to Tennessee. What's the name of your town, please?
Hohenwald.
You're on the air. Go right ahead, please.
Yes, I would like to know what the relationship between Rutherford Hayes and President Grant was.
Ari Hogenboom?
Hayes admired Grant enormously as a general. Hayes visited Grant in the White House after Grant became president. Hayes, while he was somewhat disturbed about Grant wanting to acquire Santo Domingo, he nevertheless supported Grant in the 1872 campaign when a lot of reform-minded Republicans defected and formed the Liberal Republican Party. Hayes felt just sick about the declining years, the last years of the Grant administration, and as blamed people like Roscoe Conkling in particular for the corruption in the Grant administration, felt that Grant had been misled by them. He also saw Grant and tried to dissuade Grant from trying in 1880, trying to secure a third term, running for the Republican nomination in 1880.
Solvang, California, you're next.
Hello, I'm calling about Rutherford B. Hayes as a hero of Paraguay. There's a little town called El Presidente Hayes, and I wonder if you could tell me about his role in the War of the Triple Alliance.
Roger Bridges?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
The Triple Alliance?
That's what she said.
I'm afraid I'm a little fuzzy here and don't quite understand. Well, I don't think I don't think that he had anything to do, or I'm not so sure he made any comments on the Triple Alliance of. I assume you mean of Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Italy prior to World War I.
Did he travel at all when he was in the White House beyond Washington and beyond the Ohio area?
Oh yes, Hayes was probably the most traveled president up to his time. He traveled in New England. He traveled in the South, particularly trying to encourage people to encourage the reconciliation of the nation. And in the last years of his presidency, he traveled to the West Coast. The first president to do so spent some 80 days traveling to Washington, Oregon, California, much to the dismay of William T. Sherman and others who hated seeing him out in that Indian territory.
Rutherford the Rover. I think that's a nice Rutherford the Rover.
That's what they called him?
Yes.
They called him?
Yeah, they called him that.
Westfield Center, Ohio, next.
Yeah, this is a great program you've got going. We're retired and just won't miss it. The question I have now is about his interest in education and who possibly paid for his education. It was pointed out that his father died before he was born, yet he went to Kenyon College, he went to Harvard. What motivated him to become such a good student, and how did he have the means to go through all these colleges? I'd appreciate your answer.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, his sister and his uncle and his mother all tried to give Hayes some ambition. There were times when Hayes decided he wanted to become a farmer when he was young and not go on with school, but he was prodded by his sister, mother, and uncle. The uncle had money enough to send him to some of these schools, but Rutherford's mother had property in Ohio, and some of that property was sold, so she paid a lot of the bills for college as well. So it wasn't entirely dependent upon his uncle. But his uncle, who built this place to begin with, was a prosperous trader, and he could always back up the family with money when money was needed.
Roger Bridges, how long is this porch we're sitting on? You know.
This porch currently is 80 feet wide. When Hayes was talking with his uncle about the home, that he was going to build the summer home, he confided to his diary that he told his uncle what he really wanted was a veranda with a house attached. And so the original house had a veranda around 3 sides. Of course, now it's got this 80-foot long, 16-foot wide veranda.
New Orleans, you're next. Go ahead, please. You're on with Roger Bridges and Ari Hogenboom.
I think I was taught in college 45 years ago that the election of 1876, the Republicans and the Democrats made a deal in which the Republicans got the presidency and the Democrats got rid of Reconstruction. But I haven't heard any mention of that. Is that just a myth?
Okay, there was talk of a deal, but Hayes had always said from his acceptance letter on that if the Democrats would agree to obey the 14th and 15th Amendments, allow black Republicans and white Republicans in the South to vote, that he would be willing to pull out the troops. When Hayes became president, Reconstruction had basically ended everywhere in the South except right around the immediate areas around the capitals of South Carolina and Louisiana, in Columbia, South Carolina, and New Orleans, Louisiana. The question was not whether the troops should be withdrawn, but when they would be withdrawn, because there's no way that Hayes could keep the troops in the South, since the Democratic Congress had refused to appropriate money for the Army until those troops were removed. So there's no real bargain in the end, because there was a lot of talk of bargains, but in the end Hayes gave nothing but what he had promised in his inaugural. He got the promises that South Carolina and Louisiana would obey the 14th and 15th Amendments. The South Carolinians and the Louisianians went back on those promises.
We're going to take a walk out to the gravesite as we get near the end of our program. Before we do that, though, I think I remember your work in school included a dissertation on John Sherman.
Yes, I wrote my doctoral dissertation on John Sherman, who became Hayes's Secretary of State, or Secretary of Treasury, I mean, and probably one of his 2 most important advisors.
What was he like?
John Sherman was a brother of William Tecumseh Sherman, a very bright man who wanted to go to Kenyon College but couldn't. He made his mark as an astute financier through most of his life.
Why don't we go? We just keep talking. We'll just go to the gravesite.
The Ohio Icicle. He was a rather cool man.
Well, as we go, let's take a call from Bend, Oregon. The gravesite's not too far from here. Go ahead, Ben.
Yes, hi. This question is for Ari Hogenbaum. You'll probably recognize my voice, Ari. This is Eric Signell, and I'm quite very honored to see you on this program and providing such fascinating information for everybody. And my question, Ari, is the thing that I was most interested about was the electoral, the process where there was a tie-breaking vote, and you mentioned the Davis, the fellow that was independent, and he apparently resigned. And my question was, how was it that he was replaced by a Republican?
There were no further independents. There were no more independents on the Supreme Court. The rest of the members of the Supreme Court were all regarded as members of one party or the other. Actually, I don't think there were any other Democrats left, for that matter. Bradley was picked because of all the justices. He probably, of the Republican justices, he probably was the most independent. He was the most independent of the ones that were left, and he would be the one most likely to come up with a decision that might possibly favor the Democrats.
Roger Bridges, did they do that work in public, the work of the commission?
Yes, it was mostly done in public.
Good people, the press was there? And
the press was there. It was done in Congress, it was done in public, and then the questions were sent to the commission. The commission made its decision. They sent back to the Congress, and Congress ratified it or did not do so. And of course, they always did.
I just want to tell the audience that they just joined us that behind us is Spiegel Grove. It's a 33-room, I guess you'd call it a mansion that belonged to Rutherford B. Hayes. We have a call from Peoria, Arizona. We're on our way to the gravesite. Go ahead, Peoria.
I worked for Fred Hans in Sun City, Arizona. He was a grandson of Rutherford B. Hayes, and his mother was Rutherford B. Hayes' daughter. And he has Rutherford B. Hayes' baby cup when he was a baby. And so it was really a joy and a thrill to work for the President of the United States' grandson.
How much, and over the years that you've dealt with this issue of descendants, how much, have there been any on your board?
Yes, there have been. In fact, we currently have 4 Hayes descendants on the board of 10 trustees.
And who assigns the trustees?
Well, the trustees is a self-perpetuating body. They elect their successors. And we have the president of the board is Scott Hayes, who is a great-grandson of the president and the son of Burchard Hayes, Hayes' oldest son. Then we have Stephen Hayes, who is a son of Webb Hayes the third, and Leslie McFarland, who is a son or a daughter of Arthur Hayes. And finally, we have James Hayes, who is a son of Scott B. Hayes, our president.
Every time I've been here, a couple times, there's always I don't know the words ton, but a lot of people on these pathways in the morning. How many people come over here in the morning and walk?
Well, we don't keep an exact count, but a few years ago we tried to do a count, and we discovered that there were between 700 and 1,000 people coming in every day to walk on these grounds.
Let's go to Youngstown, Ohio next. Go ahead, please.
Yes, this is Ted in Youngstown, Ohio, and I'm calling about the relationship between Edwin Stanton, who was also the Kenyon graduate and Secretary of War under Lincoln, and Harvard graduate, and Rutherford B. Hayes himself, as they had been friends. In Eerily, where you're walking there, looks just like Middle Path at Kenyon College.
Did you go to Kenyon?
Of our kids attend Kenyon.
Reaction, Edward Stanton?
I don't think they really knew one another, particularly. Do you know, Roger?
I don't believe there was a close relationship. Yeah. Obviously, they were both Cincinnati attorneys at one point, and it's quite likely that their paths crossed, but clearly they were not friends.
Roselle, next. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I was wondering if you could explain Rutherford B. Hayes' role in the 1877 railroad strike and his feelings towards labor, or labor's feelings towards him.
Well, that's a good question. I'm glad we got to that. He was always friendly to labor, and he was never really all that friendly to railroads. In fact, later in life, he was very much of an advocate of regulation of railroads. He intervened in the strike. He's been accused of breaking the strike, but he didn't really break the strike. He only intervened. He only sent troops when requested by proper authorities, namely when requested by the governors of states, sometimes mayors of cities. and only to protect property from being destroyed by rioters. In fact, specifically in St. Louis, he ordered the troops not to interfere with the strikers and not to operate railroads, but just simply to maintain peace, to protect property.
Roger Bridges, our next call we're going to take in a moment is from Lexington, Virginia. It's interesting because two men in history are buried there, Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee. Both of their horses are buried there with them. Little Sorrel for the Stonewall Jackson, and Traveler for Robert E. Lee. The reason I mention this is obvious, because right over here we're going to see it. What horses? It's a nice leading. What horses are buried over here?
Well, we have two horses. One is Old Ned, who died in 1871 at the age of 36, who was Sardis Burchard's carriage horse and was probably the oldest horse in Ohio when he died, and obviously, having been in the family that long, was a friend. The other was Old Whitey, who was an extraordinarily large horse, much too large really for an officer to ride, who had belonged to Major Hastings in his regiment, but Hayes was known to have rode him occasionally, and the horse was sent here after the war, and as I say, was an extraordinarily beautiful and large horse, and became a family pet.
Before we go there, we got a call first from Roselle, Illinois. Go ahead, Roselle. Roselle, are you there? Can you all hear that? Huh? We're losing. Roselle, are you there? Let's try Lexington, Virginia. Are you there? Hello, Lexington.
Hello. Hello.
Go ahead, Lexington.
Yeah, I got a question about. I know McKinley was also in the same regiment as Hayes, and I think the other person you were looking for was Taft. I think there's a monument actually at the Battle of Antietam reflecting that Taft was there. But my question is, what was the military relationship between Hayes and McKinley? And also, since McKinley was in the House at the same time Hayes was president, what was their political relationship? And I'll hang up and listen.
Very close. In a word.
Can you explain how close?
McKinley was a very young man in the regiment, and Hayes was very fond of him. Lucy, who at times when the regiment was in winter quarters, Lucy would join them, and she was very, very fond of McKinley. In fact, she referred to him as the boy stood on the burning deck, because he used to throw wood in the fire all the time and practically roast her. He regarded her as a kind of a mother. He was a very young man at the time. And Hayes gave him advice as to where to go to set up practice in law. And Hayes gave him advice toward the end, even at the end of his life. Hayes was advising him, giving him good advice, which McKinley didn't follow, for that matter. Hayes was telling him not to be so political in his appointments in Ohio.
Roger Bridges, let's talk a little bit about this gravesite. How long have they been here, and who is here?
Well, who we have here are Rutherford and Lucy. They are now buried here. They came here in 1916 when the center was opened. Before that, they were buried about 2 miles down the road here in the Oakwood Cemetery. Buried behind them is Webb Cook Hayes I and his wife Mary Miller Hayes. Webb was the one who carried through on his father's wishes, actually, to create a museum and a library, and so he's been honored by being buried here as well. And this is, as we often like to say, is in fact the first presidential library.
We want to take another call. We want to make sure that our audience knows where we are. By the way, the reason we didn't show you Old Ned and Old Whitey is because they're on the other side of the fence down there, and you can't get a camera back there.
Right.
How long have they been buried there?
Well, since the 1870s, 1871 and 1872 or 3, as I recall. So it's been 120 years.
Let's take a call from Danville, California. Go ahead, Danville. You're on the air.
Yes, there was a mention of Chief Joseph, and no one said anything about it. What I'm interested in of the Indians during Hayes' administration. There was a lot of Indian history going on, and I'd like to know what part he took or his administration took. Thank you.
Thanks. We had a call earlier and we didn't answer it on the way that the Hayes administration treated the Indians.
Well, basically, the Hayes administration continued the Grant administration policies, which were really light years away from what went on before. Before, there's just simply annihilation. Under Grant, there were attempts to just simply stop the slaughter of Indians, and Hayes. What Hayes did was to stop the removal of Indians. Now, some Indians were removed at the beginning of his administration. The movement got underway during Grant's administration to remove Nez Perce Indians and to remove Ponca Indians. Both of those, one resulted in a war and the other resulted in a terrible suffering on the part of the Poncas to go to Oklahoma.
That's where the name Ponca City, Oklahoma comes from.
Yeah, right. And anyhow, what Hayes did was stop that removal of Indian policy.
Now, our crack crew, believe it or not, has found these horses with their camera. We wouldn't plan on this, so Michelle Better walked with a camera all the way behind this fence over there. How much interest do you have when people come here to see these? What do you have? They're rocks over there.
There are a couple of rocks engraved with their names on them. Almost all people who come here and who learn about the burial of Old Whitey and Old Ned make the trip back there, particularly those people who have children. In fact, I would have to say children find them much more interesting than they do the president and his wife.
We have a call from Livermore, California. Go ahead, Livermore. You're on the air.
I'd like to say my father is a real scholar on Rutherford B. Hayes. And second, I'd like to follow up on the question about the Native Americans. What was Hayes' position on westward expansion?
Roger Bridges.
I'm sorry, I didn't.
Westward expansion?
Westward expansion, yes.
Yeah. The westward expansion had basically occurred as far as, say, annexation of a place like Canada is concerned. He'd be very happy if the Canadians would elect to become part of the United States, but he was opposed to any kind of move that might any aggressive move to acquire Canada. The westward movement had basically the United States did stretch from ocean to ocean when he was president.
If you've just joined us, we're at our 19th stop of 41 we're going to make, our presidential series at C-SPAN. Educators, we want to remind you again, the number to call if you want to join our C-SPAN in the Classroom organization is 202-626-4858. You can dial now and get through, and we'll get the material off to you as soon as possible. That's 202-626-4858. We've got time for a couple more calls. We go next to Toledo, Ohio. Go ahead, please. Toledo, you're on the air.
Yes, thank you for taking my call. I'm calling from Toledo, Ohio, and I'm kind of a Civil War buff, and I'm very interested in President Hayes. I do have a question about his retirement there on the grounds. Was he able to stroll the grounds and into town with comfort and at ease, or did he have some kind of a security system with him?
Roger Bridges.
There was no security system for presidents in those days. Hayes was tremendously accessible to whoever wanted to talk to him or come and see him. Journalists were constantly amazed that they could find them out on the grounds grubbing wood or grubbing stumps or what have you. Hayes was always interested in the flora and fauna. He had a large orchard. He walked into town frequently, as many as 3 times a day. Of course, it's only a couple of miles downtown.
We're at the graves, say that again, the Hayes gravesite here on the Spiegel Grove. I guess you don't call it a plantation, but it's how many acres again?
25 acres.
When he was in the White House, first telephone ever?
For
the White House?
They had a telephone in the White House, and but it was really hooked into the Treasury Department, and so they did use that. Most of the communication, though, was by telegraph. They had a telegraph office in the White House.
What did you say? I think you were telling me about they did a lot of singing on the phone?
Oh yeah, that seemed to be the rage in those days. People would sing over the telephone, and so it was a new toy, a new instrument, and they'd be absolutely amazed. And supposedly, a guy with a great bass voice in the Treasury Department cracked the transmitter. He was with his powerful voice.
Great Neck, New York. You're next for our guest. Go ahead, please.
Well, first, I want to congratulate your channel for the terrific job that it's doing. You're changing the nature of politics in New York. I was very curious. as to whether there was any connection between President Hayes and Arthur Garfield Hayes. Their politics is so much alike. I guess the Arthur and the Garfield is maybe from the other president.
Well, there's no question that that Hayes regarded Garfield's election as vindication for his own terms in office. He had more questions about Arthur. After all, Arthur represented what he thought were the corrupt elements of the Republican Party, although he later came to appreciate him.
But I think the caller was asking about the lawyer, Arthur Garfield Hayes,
sorry.
And what the connection was between them. And to tell you the truth, I've wondered about that myself, and maybe somebody could, just like we were informed earlier in the program about something we didn't know.
There's your next book.
Yeah.
How many children did these two people have together?
8.
Boys and girls?
They had 7 boys, 1 girl.
How many of them lived beyond a year?
5 children lived beyond 2 years of age. 2 died during the Civil War, and 1 died in 1873-84, the last one, Manning Force Hayes. But the other 5 lived to adulthood and all became contributing to society.
Our next stop is the James Garfield home over in Mentor, Ohio. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right. I think isn't there a different way to pronounce that? We'll find out. Let's go to Reading, Pennsylvania next. Go ahead, please. Hello, Reading. You're on the air.
Take it that Hayes had a great frustration tolerance to see some of his programs frustrated. I heard you say that he was upright. Was he a man of absolute integrity and truthfulness? Any demagoguery at all?
Roger Bridges.
Well,
this is your moment, you know.
we certainly consider him to be a man of absolute integrity. There's no question that he attempted to always tell the truth and to serve his country as he saw best.
Ari Hogenboom, independent historian's view?
Yeah, well, I've lived with this guy for so many years, and I've really become fond of him. But I think one of the reasons why I've become fond of him is that this is totally truthful. You know, even when he and Lucy were engaged, and they were trying to keep it secret, everybody knew they were engaged because the two of them were so unconvincing. Lucy said that she told John Herron, with whom Hayes shared an office, a white lie. People just saw right through that, and Hayes would make these denials, and everybody. It was so transparent. He was always extremely truthful.
We only have a short time left, and I want to thank an individual who's done a superb job on getting our audio system set up here today, Ruth Ann Winterhalter, who is in our bus on the audio. It's a tough job. We go now to Fairfax, Virginia. Go ahead, please.
Yes, my question is on Corner of the Realm at the time. As you might know, the 1877 Indian Head Penny is the rarest date of that series. The only one with lesser vintage was the 1909 S, and that was because of the transition to the Lincoln set. Also, the 3-cent piece was not made for general circulation. The 5-cent nickel, there were only 500 made, and the 20-cent piece only 510. Would that be because of the recession at the time? Because I noticed the larger coinage was the miniatures were up there.
Roger Bridges?
I'm sorry, I know very little about numismatic history.
Ari Hogan.
I haven't a clue.
You're talking earlier about that being a period of depression.
Yeah.
When did it become the Gilded Age? What years were those?
Well, it became the Gilded Age when people look back on it. You know, like all of these, like the gay 90s became the gay 90s, probably in the depression of the 30s. But the depression lasted really until about 1879. By 1879, the country was really coming out of the Depression after the resumption of specie payments. Now that's monetary. Hayes is was very orthodox monetarily speaking. Hard money, gold standard.
Because we're almost out of time. What was the country like in 1880 at the end of the term?
Well, the country was returning pretty much to a more normal period. It was thriving. It was a period of invention, a period of right on the cusp of tremendous industrialization. And it was a period of really intense two-party competition.
Canton, Ohio, you're next. Go ahead, please. Home of the First Ladies Museum. Go ahead, please.
Yes, good morning, gentlemen. It's been a really interesting program listening to what you've had to say. Rutherford and Lucy were my great-great-great-grandparents on my mother's side. And I just wanted to know a little bit more about the family history and where other descendants are now in Ohio.
Let me start by asking Roger Bridges, is there a place you can go to connect into the descendants?
Well, of course you can. You can go to the Presidential Library, or today you can go to our website, rbhayes.org, and find the complete genealogy of the Hayes family.
rbhayes.org, is that lower case?
All lowercase.
By the way, I didn't ask you earlier, who supports this place?
We are supported jointly by a private foundation, the Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Center, Inc., and the state of Ohio through the Ohio Historical Society.
What's it cost to run this place a year?
About $1.8 million.
How many people work here?
About 50.
And we go to Niagara Falls, New York next. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I just wanted to let you know that the Triple Alliance in question a while ago was Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay, which practically decimated Paraguay in the late 1870s, the War of the Triple Alliance.
Does that help you,
Mr.
Mr.
Hogan? You may have
Hogan?
the answer about it.
I didn't quite catch my
The Triple Alliance was Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay.
that's the Triple Alliance. Oh, I see. Well, he did make this. He did arbitrate a dispute between Paraguay and Argentina, I think it was, and awarded a section of Paraguay which has it's called let's see, Presidente Hayes, and the main city there is Villa Hayes.
Did he speak any other languages than English?
Yeah, he studied German quite diligently. He wanted to read Schiller in the original when he was a young man. As Roger said earlier, he was an intellectual. He read, loved Emerson. He read widely. It was not only history, but many books.
I asked earlier what he would be like if you were sitting around having dinner with him. What would she have been like?
Lucy was also a very interesting conversationalist. She was a homebody, but her talk obviously would also be sprinkled with intellectual subjects. She was highly educated. She didn't like to write much, however.
How many
vivacious? I would like to throw in
exactly.
Vivacious. Had a great singing voice. She had a great alto voice, and she played a guitar and sang very, very well.
Next call, we go to Columbus, Ohio. Go ahead, please. Columbus, you're on the air.
Yes, good job, C-SPAN. I got a question. When we were up there in Fremont last year visiting, or it might have been 2 years ago, visiting his house, the historian who took us around mentioned that there had recently been an issue presented to Congress by the trust that runs his home that to have Congress provide some financial aid or perhaps eventually turn it over to the National Park System. However, certain members of Congress got up and argued against that because of Rutherford B. Hayes' alleged involvement in a supposed deal with the Democrats of the South, which ended the occupation of the South and in effect allowed the South to continue the persecution of the blacks. I wonder if the historians would expound on that to see if Congress, members of Congress, were under a false impression as to what actually happened, because that doesn't square with what the historian said earlier.
Roger Bridges.
Well, obviously, we think that those members of Congress who thought that Hayes obtained the presidency because of a fraudulent deal were mistaken. It's a question of education, I think, more than anything else. And certainly, when I was an undergraduate and even an early graduate student, that was the received wisdom. But recent historians, like Ari and others, have noted that he had no chance to do anything else, and he thought he had arranged for fair treatment of minorities and Yankees in the South, and the South simply reneged on its promises.
Will this place ever be supported by federal tax dollars?
I would never say never. Certainly, this place is too important for anything ever to happen to it in terms that it would not be adequately supported.
As you know, the FDR Library is often said to be the first of the presidential libraries. That was 1939. When was this formed?
This place was opened to the public as a presidential library and museum in 1916.
Why is it then not listed among people as the first presidential library?
Well, it's primarily because we are not a part of the presidential library system. The presidential library system includes every president since Hoover, who came after Roosevelt in terms of creation. But because we are not a part of that system, when they give out the information, which the news media usually goes to first, they simply don't recognize us.
We're going to take a call in a second, but there's flowers over here on this gravesite, and every year we understand that the President of the United States sends flowers. Are those the President's flowers?
These are not the President's flowers here. These are the result of a local military veterans organization put them here because those flowers have long since dissipated. But this is a common practice for the President to do at every one of his predecessors.
How does it work, for instance, on that day? What's his birthday is October 4th every year, and are flowers placed right here?
Yes, they are. It's not always on October 4th. We do it on the weekend closest to his birthday, usually as part of a Civil War reenactment encampment that we have here. And representatives of the President, usually always a military officer, general officer, comes and places those flowers in memory of Hayes offered by the President of the United States.
Where does the general come from?
Sometimes Indianapolis, sometimes Minneapolis. It used to be that he came from Columbus.
And how many people come with him?
Usually he has a retinue of 5 or 6 people, including a bugler who plays taps.
And how many people show up for that celebration?
Well, for the celebration here, we have normally now between 3,500 and 5,000 people who attend the wreath laying.
Let's take another call from West Columbia, South Carolina. Go ahead, please. West Columbia, you're on the air. Are you there, West Columbia, South Carolina? Let's go to Atlanta next. Atlanta, you're on the air.
Yes, thank you for taking my call.
Atlanta, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Hello?
Go ahead.
Hello?
Hello?
Yes, thank you for taking my call. The historians had mentioned the 2 sons that they died in the Civil War. Did they die in combat? Did they die in that time frame? And where are they buried?
Ari Hogenboom?
They were infants when they died. They were born during the Civil War, and Hayes hardly knew them. And in fact, he was almost a little ashamed of himself because the Battle of Chickamauga occurred shortly after his little boy Joe died, and he caught himself and he said, "I'm grieving more over the loss of the Battle of Chickamauga than I am over my own dear son." I said earlier, his commitment to the war was so enormous.
Why don't we walk back? You know, I don't know how much time we've got left, but in the meantime, we just walk back up to the house. Again, Roger Bridges, how big is this area inside?
25 acres inside the gates, inside the fences.
We have a call from West Columbia, South Carolina. Go ahead, please.
Good morning. I would just like to say I was sitting in my living room watching your show with my daughters. I am also a descendant of President Hayes. I'm also involved in my local government here in South Carolina. In response to the lady that called in earlier, if there was a way to exchange phone numbers, I would love to talk with her. She has family members in the state of South Carolina as well as Alabama. We have lots of pictures, interviews that's been done by our family members, some valuable information that she may be interested in.
Somebody pick up on that?
Well, we also would love to talk with you here at the Presidential Center, and if you could leave your number, you can believe we would get back in touch with you.
Next call, we have the Dalles, Oregon. Go ahead, please.
Hello.
Hi.
This is Yvonne Beamer, and I have a cookbook that was published in 1879 by M.C. Tyree, and the name of it is Housekeeping in Old Virginia. And on the inside of this book, it says that many distinguished American women paid tribute to this book. Mrs. President R.B. Hayes, and then there was Mrs. Chief Justice M.R. Wade, Mrs. Secretary of State W.M. Everett, United States Governor H. Pendleton, George H. Pendleton, U.S. Senator M.C. Butler, and so forth. This book is in absolute and total mint condition, and I am 76 years old. I found this at my mother's estate. I don't know where she got it, but I would like to know if anyone would be interested in this book.
Roger Bridges.
Well, certainly, we would be interested in this book. We, as a matter of fact, have a huge 19th century book recipe collection, and we would love to add this book to that collection.
How many of the children were in the White House while President Hayes was there for the one term?
Well, the two younger children were there just as young as kids. The three older boys were in and out. In fact, Webb served as a secretary. Rudd, the oldest boy, actually was going into law practice on his own in Toledo, I believe, is where he began practicing. Webb was a secretary for a while and was really quite good. And young Rudd was in college most of the time. So Webb was with them of the older kids. There are three older kids and two younger kids, and the three older kids, Webb was with them most of the time. Webb supervised the addition to the house.
Is your book still in the bookstores?
Oh yes. Well, it's still in print.
And the title?
It's Rutherford B. Hayes, Warrior and President, University Press of Kansas.
We're almost 2.5 hours into this, Roger Bridges. We visited the grave site, which our audience has been able to see. We started at the gates out front, which used to be at the White House. When people come in, they see the big building there. About how many square feet is your library and museum?
The library and museum is about 55,000 square feet.
And that's been there since 1916?
Not the whole building, but the building, the first portion was built in 1916. It's been added to over the years, and it's now 55,000 square feet.
And the house was built in what year?
The house was begun in 1859, and it also underwent two major expansions. The second wing was added in 1878, 79, as Ari said, supervised by Webb, and the final section was added in 1889. It included the huge dining room, several bedrooms upstairs. They certainly hoped that they would be able to entertain grandchildren, and were sorely disappointed, as you might expect, when Lucy died just before the expansion was completed.
Yeah. Let me take a call from Fremont, Ohio, right here where we are. Go ahead, Fremont, you're on the air.
Hello, this is Fremont, Ohio, and I have a daughter that lives in Argentina, and they had a big article down in a newspaper there that said that town in Paraguay, that nobody in the United States was interested in Hayes, and that in Delaware they had no interest in him, but they don't know about Fremont. And
well, I can understand that people in Argentina would not be happy about Hayes. On the other hand, we do know that the people in Paraguay are extremely grateful to Hayes because of the decision he made. And some years ago, in fact, we sent a bust of Hayes to Hayes province in Paraguay.
Let's go to Newburgh, Maryland. Go ahead, Newburgh, you're on the air.
Yes, good morning and God bless you. This is, well, they call me Owl. Okay, and I'm from the Logan Hayes family around Stanford, Kentucky. Okay, and what I would like to know is if, as I can see, Mr. Hayes was truly a very upstanding person and tried to make the world better for all people. And I want to know if there is a controversy, like in the Jefferson family, about race, because all the Hayes family, Hayes and Logan part of our family are Caucasian, and then they married Native American, and they also married African American.
Roger Bridges?
Well, to the best of my knowledge, Rutherford B. Hayes did not father any children outside of marriage, so that
never been any controversy at all.
There has never been a whiff of controversy of which I'm aware. I'm not sure, Ari, whether you ever ran across any.
Yeah, well, he kissed a woman in the White House once, and somebody tried to make much out of it. He was really annoyed because she happened to be the daughter of a friend, and he'd been kissing her ever since she was a little kid. And she came in, and he gave her a kiss, and then somebody tried to make something out of it. But he was annoyed that somebody had misinterpreted.
In a couple, we got one more call here, and then we're going to wrap this up. It's is it Tupelo, Michigan? Is that the way you pronounce it?
Tupelo, Mississippi.
Oh, Mississippi. Go ahead, please. I'm sorry.
Yes.
That's Elvis Presley's hometown.
Right. This is Fuzz Miller. I used to live about a block away from Spiegel Grove there in Fremont, and I've moved down south. But I just like to recall the many memories I had of photographing families and students on the grounds. And this program has been very informative, and I really enjoy it. Thank you.
This is a terrible thing to ask somebody, but what have we missed?
Prison reform. He was very much interested in prison reform, and was head of, at the end of his life, he was opposed to the death penalty, and when he was governor of the state and president, he commuted a lot of sentences from death to imprisonment, life imprisonment, because of his opposition to the death penalty. He once accompanied a client that he failed to defend sufficiently to the gallows, and it was a horrible experience for him, and he never forgot it.
What did we miss?
Well, I think we also missed perhaps his interest in education and history. This is a man that found one of his most satisfying roles in Congress, serving on the Smithsonian Committee. Clearly, he had in mind something that would keep people aware of their past through museums and libraries. And he really, although we give Webb Hayes credit for this, Webb was really carrying out his father's wishes.
I want to point out to our audience that we have a website set up particularly for this series, and on there, by the way, you can see the Chaz Fagan portraits. Chaz Fagan, an artist from Pennsylvania, a young guy, and about 32 years old, has done all 41 presidents over a period of about 3 or 4 months. I'm not sure it's ever been done before at one sitting, not one sitting, but one group of portraits, and we'll be showing you more about that as this series goes on. But it's AmericanPresidents.org if you want to get on and see the rest of the material, and all these programs are what they call streaming. They're streaming on the, or they're streamed on the website, so you can go back and listen to them and watch them if you want to. In addition to that, remember the James Garfield program is on Monday, July 26th, starting at 9 o'clock. All of these programs are rerun on Friday night at 8 o'clock East Coast time. And one more time for the C-SPAN, the classroom number, 202-626-4858. That's what these shows are all about, education, 202-626-4858. And we're trying to work it out today so that there won't be a busy signal when you call. So hopefully when you dial that you'll be able to get through, and we'll get back to you with the material that's available to you. Thank you both I know you came all the way from the great state of Maine.
Yep.
Where, believe it or not, the audience will be envious. Mr. Hogenboom lives on an island in the summer.
Yeah, without electricity. Nobody can watch this.
How long? Yeah, that's, when we go back, no, you have to not worry about being bothered about all this. And Roger Bridges, thank you for your participation and your terrific staff that helped us out here.
Well, thank you. You're always welcome to return anytime you want to, Brian.
Are you still, do you still have those dinners here on Christmas?
We are still having those dinners on Christmas. You can call the Hayes Presidential Center at 1-800-998-7737 to find out about them.
And it costs?
$200 per person.
And what's the reason for them?
This is our principal fundraiser during the year.
Thanks to Peter Sland, Gary Ellenwood, and the rest of our crew. That's it from Fremont, Ohio, and the Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Center.
Hurrah for Hayes and honest ways, with millions in the chorus. We've had enough of shouting high and sharing Lucas hiding. The men we want are on the flag, still true and trust confiding. There's not a truth and not a place, corruption's too.